In the 16th century, the Europeans would sail to the Indian subcontinent in a race for riches, first seizing trade routes, then the land itself. By the 1800s, the British would control most of the subcontinent, exploiting India's wealth and ruling it as the crown jewel of their empire. But there were already thriving peoples here, with civilizations and history stretching back thousands of years. These empires were among the most powerful the world had ever seen, from humanity's most magnificent cities and monuments to some of the most peaceful and enlightened cultures in human history. The Indians were pioneers of knowledge, advancing mathematics, charting the movements of the planets, and offering the world unique philosophies. India withstood the ancient era, the Middle Ages, and now the modern period. With a rising population of over 1 billion people and increased tension from their neighbors, can they continue on? To understand this fascinating land, we must start from the beginning. For many scholars, it begins with a history of Adivasi. The Adivasi are the ancient native peoples of India who had lived on the subcontinent for anywhere up to 30,000 years. These tribes inhabited India as nomads and semi-nomad long before anyone else. They left behind very little archaeological evidence, and what history they have survived orally in their modern descendants. Then came the first major settled civilization in India, the Indus River Valley Civilization. The Indus Valley Civilization emerged in the late 4th millennium BC along the Indus River. They were one of the first great urban societies on the planet. But despite existing at the same time as other civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, comparatively little is known about them. The Indus Valley Civilization was an urban culture that thrived along the river for about 2,000 years, reaching its height around 2600 BC and declining after 1900 BC. At one point, it might have been home to up to 5 million people, living in hundreds of cities and towns. Excavations at major sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, both of which are in modern-day Pakistan, show a complex urban culture with stone architecture, planned cities, and complex infrastructure. The Indus Valley Civilization relied on monsoon agriculture to feed themselves. And they also had a sewage system and public baths that would not be matched elsewhere in the world for over 1,000 years. Evidence shows that the Indus Valley Civilization was engaged in trade, with documents and seals used by merchants, along with settlement walls to control entry and exit to towns, suggesting a developed merchant culture. From their graves, we know that they believed in some sort of afterlife, and differences between the graves show some kind of wealth-based social hierarchy. However, we still cannot decipher the writings from this civilization. As a result, although we can now point to hundreds of Indus Valley Civilization sites, so much of their lives and society are lost to us. Despite all their achievements, we cannot even name a single person who lived in this civilization for its 2,000-year-long history. What caused the fall of the Indus Valley Civilization? Firstly, the Indus Valley Civilization didn't fall at a single decisive moment. It appears to have gradually petered out over centuries between about 1900 BC and 1300 BC. The most likely explanation is climate. After 1800 BC, the climate of the Indus region became cooler and drier, which affected the monsoons and made it harder to practice the agriculture needed for these large cities. Earthquakes also caused the course of the Indus River to shift westward over time, which deprived cities of their vital water source. Their cities declined, but the Indus Valley people themselves didn't necessarily die with them. Most scholars believe the Indus people migrated southeast deeper into the subcontinent. One theory holds that the Dravidian language family, which is spoken mostly in southeast India and includes Telugu, Tamil, and Kannada, originally came from these Indus Valley migrants. With the decline of the Indus Valley civilization, a third group of people enter our story, and it's these people that most Indians see as their ancient predecessors, the Vedic peoples. The Vedic people appear to have hailed from Central Asia and began migrating into northwestern India in around 1500 BC. They called themselves Arya and are sometimes called the Indo-Aryans. Initially, they were nomadic peoples, but over time they settled in India in villages and small towns. By 1200 BC, the Vedic peoples had crossed the Ganges River and began penetrating deeper into central and eastern India. The Vedic people brought the domestication of the horse to India. First domesticated by Indo-European peoples around 2200 BC, horses served as pack animals to help in their migrations, and pulled chariots which were characteristic of Vedic warfare. They also brought their own language in Vedic Sanskrit. The Vedas are a collection of dense, complicated, and beloved religious texts that are still in use today. There are 4 Vedas. The oldest, longest, and most well-known is the Rig Veda. There's also the Yajur Veda, Samaveda, and the Atharva Veda. The Vedas were the earliest sacred texts of India, composed around 1500 BC, forming the foundation of Indian philosophy, ritual, and spiritual thought. As for what that society looked like, Vedic people began as semi-nomadic tribal pastoralists and practiced that lifestyle in India for the first few centuries. Initially, they were concentrated in the Punjab and northwest India before gradually moving down and settling in the regions fed by the Ganges and Yamuna rivers. Tribes could settle into semi-permanent villages, while others spent all or most of their time living nomadically. These tribes engaged in trade, diplomacy, raiding, and warfare with one another, which aligned with their shared warrior culture. 2 of the most important tribes were the Purus and Bharatas. The arrival of ironworking to India after 1200 BC enabled the Vedic peoples to tame the thick forests and jungles that dominated much of the continent, and encouraged them to make more permanent settlements. This led the Vedic people to gradually abandon their nomadic lifestyle for more permanent settlement in small agricultural communities, although nothing so large that it could be called a city. As Vedic society developed, its social structure changed too. Initially, the primary social division in Vedic India was between warriors and non-warriors, but in time a new social structure emerged dubbed Varna, also known as the caste system. The Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda describes the Varna system in terms of the body. At the top, representing the head, there are the Brahmins. The Brahmins are the priestly class of India responsible for studying, understanding, and educating on religious texts. All classes owed them reverence and respect, and kings throughout Indian history were expected to patronize and care for them. Below them, representing the hands and arms, were the Kshatriyas. The Kshatriya class is usually translated as warriors, and that's fairly accurate. The Kshatriya class also included kings, nobles, and even administrators, essentially anyone who ruled or exercised power over others, showing the close ties between violence and authority that underpinned most societies in this period. For the thighs, we have the third Varna, Vaishya. Vaishya are mostly farmers, animal husbandmen, merchants, and businessmen. More specifically, it referred to land-owning farmers rather than just anyone who worked in the fields. And pretty much anyone who might employ another person to work for them could be a Vaishya. Which brings us to the feet of the Varna system as described in the Purusha Sukta. The Shudra. Shudra is generally translated as laborer or sometimes peasant and referred to most people in society. These people tilled the soil owned by the Vaishya, crafted the weapons wielded by the Kshatriya, or swept the floors walked by the Brahmins. Overall, their job was to serve the other 3 Varna. Further south, the Deccan Plateau saw its share of cultures known only from archaeological remains. For example, the Jorwe culture in modern-day Maharashtra lasted for some 700 years, between 1400 and 700 BC. One peculiarity about Jorwe culture is that they seem to have been fascinated with cutting bits off people. Almost every discovered body had their feet cut off before being buried, and multiple artifacts show Jorwe gods as being headless. Archaeologists are still puzzled as to what these things mean. Although the legacy of these people isn't as obvious and their stories have been lost, they are every bit a part of the history of India as the Vedic peoples they lived alongside. The Vedic period ran for about 1,000 years until the 6th or 7th centuries BC. There's no single event that ends the Vedic period, but a combination of cultural, religious, and social factors marked a new period distinct from the one that came before. From around 700 to 600 BC, cities began to form in large numbers for the first time since the days of the Indus Valley civilization. These cities became the centers of power for a new type of political unit, the Janapadas. Janapadas were essentially city-states or townships, and over time they were consolidated into larger Mahajanapadas, which might be considered kingdoms or even minor empires. There were 16 of these Mahajanapadas. Some of the most notable ones include Kuru, evolving from the Kuru kingdom, Vaji on the sites of modern-day Bihar, and Magadha. More importantly, these cities provided a place for new intellectual, cultural, and spiritual developments that would transform India. This period is known for the birth of several of the world's oldest and most important religions. Jainism emerged in the 6th century BC due to the actions of the ascetic monk Mahavira. Mahavira was a prince in eastern India who left his life of luxury behind at age 30 to pursue the harsh ascetic life. After 12 years of meditation and reflection, he achieved what Jains call Kevala Jnana, a sort of transcendence or omniscience. In doing so, he became a Tirthankara, one who was created a way to transcend the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth known as samsara. According to Jain tradition, he amassed some 50,000 followers before his death in the 520s BC. Jainism continued to find adherents across India and still has millions of followers today. Jains believe that Jainism has always existed in the endless cycle of time, and the first Tirthanka of the cycle, named Rishabhanatha, actually existed millions of years ago. Jainism calls for its followers to obey 5 important vows. They must always tell the truth, they must never steal, they must practice chastity, if not outright celibacy, they must avoid greed and possessiveness, and last but not least, they must practice total non-violence. This non-violence ideal, known as ahimsa, symbolized by the iconic open palm, is probably the most famous part of Jainism. Jains and non-Jains have used its ideas, especially that of non-violence, to shape Indian history ever since. The second of the major religious developments was Buddhism. The Buddha, born Siddhartha Gautama, was a prince of the Shakya clan in the Himalayas, and according to Buddhist tradition, led a perfectly sheltered life for 30 years. It was only then that he stepped outside and witnessed the truth of the world. According to the story, Siddhartha first encountered an elderly man. Having been raised in the palace and never laying eyes upon old age, Siddhartha was shocked to learn that all men would grow old. Next, he encountered a sick man and learned that all men were vulnerable to disease and pain. Last, Siddhartha laid his eyes upon a dead body and learned that all men would eventually die. These experiences shattered Siddhartha's sheltered delusions and made him realize that suffering was inevitable in life. However, when he saw an ascetic monk, he learned that one could live a virtuous life and potentially escape the seemingly endless suffering of life. Siddhartha became an ascetic and embarked on a spiritual journey. He attempted several methods towards enlightenment before deciding to sit underneath a Bodhi tree in modern-day Bihar and meditate for 49 days. By doing so, the Buddha achieved nirvana, the complete elimination of desire that untethered him from the endless cycle of samsara. The Buddha spent the rest of his life traveling and preaching his philosophy. So what did the Buddha actually preach? The Four Noble Truths are the basis of the Buddhist religion. There is suffering, this suffering has a cause, this suffering has an end, and the way to teach that end is the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is the basic rules of conduct that all Buddhists should follow. Those being right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. He called for Buddhists to walk the middle path between extreme indulgence and extreme restraint, which was much more reasonable for the average person than life as a total ascetic. Emerging from the same culture and time period, Buddhism shares much with Jain and later Hindu beliefs. The concepts of karma and reincarnation are shared among all of them, and Buddhism also shares Jainism's strict rejection of violence. Buddhism is one of the oldest continuously practiced religions and still has millions of adherents. While it would shape Indian history over the coming centuries and remains highly respected in India, over time it would migrate out of the subcontinent and almost die in its birthplace, while finding a new lease of life in East and Southeast Asia. There were 16 Mahajanapadas throughout the region. However, the centerpiece of this development was the Magadha region, which became the cradle of India's first great empires. King of Magadha, Bimbisara, started the Haryana dynasty in 454 BC after annexing the kingdom of Anga, one of the other Mahajanapadas. There were a few reasons why the Magadha region was so productive for empires. Firstly, the environment was perfect for rice agriculture. This meant large food surpluses for non-farming occupations like blacksmiths and merchants. And stable farming meant a stable tax base for local rulers. Taxes and extra food meant that Magadha could raise larger armies than their rivals. The region also had good access to iron for tools and weaponry for that army. And the area was home to elephants, which were a prominent feature of Indian warfare. Bimbisara was known as a wise and ambitious king, who had even met Prince Siddhartha before he became the Buddha, becoming one of his greatest supporters after the Buddha attained enlightenment. However, his life would drastically change as his son, Ajatashatru, would be influenced by Buddha's cousin and rival Devadatta to betray his father and become king. At around 493 BC, Bimbisara was captured in jail and assassinated by his own son for the throne. After Bimbisara's death, Ajatashatru regretted his actions, especially after learning that he had just become a father himself. He later became a follower of the Buddha and sought redemption. Ajatashatru later conquered Vaishali, Kasi, and Kosala and expanded the Haryanka dynasty. After him, his son Udyabhadra also continued his reign and developed the foundation of Pataliputra to convert it into a full-fledged city. After Udyabhadra, more rulers ruled after the Haryanka dynasty. The last ruler, Nagatasaka, took the throne after murdering his father and ruled for 24 years until 413 BC, when the people of Magadha revolted against the Haryanka dynasty's rule and Shishunaga was placed on the throne. Shishunaga, 413 BC to 395 BC, was a viceroy during the Haryankas and was the son of the ruler of Vaishali. The people chose him to rule, and he quickly recruited his son to rule Varanasi, and he himself would rule Rajagriha. Shishunaga later conquered the Avanti region of the Pradyota dynasty. He was succeeded by his son Kalashoka in 395 BC. Kalashoka continued his father's work of consolidating the kingdom and later divided the kingdom among his 10 sons. However, this was the last generation the Shishunaga dynasty would exist, as the last king, Mahanandin, was killed by his father's illegitimate son, Mahapadmananda, in the year of 345 BC, forming the short-lived Nanda dynasty, which wouldn't last all that long, but it clung on just long enough to see the arrival of an outsider to India in the form of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great entered India in 326 BC after conquering the Persian Empire. He entered the Punjab and entered the Jhelum River, known to the Greeks as the Hydaspes, where he met an Indian king identified in Greek sources as Porus. In May 326 BC, Porus marched his armies to meet Alexander at the Hydaspes. In the resulting battle, Porus's men fought well, but Alexander's forces proved more capable and managed to encircle and slaughter most of his army. Porus himself was injured and ultimately captured. However, Alexander was impressed by Porus's fighting spirit and decided not only to keep him in power, but cooperate with him as he moved deeper into India. Porus accepted, and his armies marched with Alexander eastwards, capturing the city of Sangala together later that year. Alexander's conquests stopped at the Beas River, known as the Hyphasis to the Greeks, later that same year. His exhausted army forced the conqueror to turn back and leave India. This decision was also made because of stories that another, much larger empire, probably the Nanda Empire, awaited in the east with 200,000 men, tens of thousands of cavalry, and thousands of war elephants. Porus was left in charge of Alexander's conquered territory east of the Jhelum Hydaspes River, but according to Greek sources, he was killed by a rival Greek general a few years after Alexander's death. Porus did not live to take advantage of the opportunities Alexander's death created, but another ruler and another empire was about to emerge to seize power and rise to heights never before seen in India. In 320 BC, the Nanda Empire was overthrown by an ambitious man named Chandragupta Maurya. Sources disagree on Chandragupta's origins. Some describe him as the son of the previous king, while others suggest he was from a family of peacock farmers. We also don't know how exactly he overthrew the Nanda, although some sources credit his advisor and spy master Kautala for helping him do so. Chandragupta rapidly seized power and began pushing the borders of his new Mauryan Empire west. Over the following years, he seized control of the areas India once held by Alexander, which led him into conflict with the Seleucid Empire. This confrontation between one of India's greatest empires and the largest of Alexander's successors is one of history's great lost wars. It's mentioned offhandedly by a few Greek authors, but we don't know anything about how it played out. What we do know is that Chandragupta won and took all of the territory Alexander had conquered in the Indus Valley and into Afghanistan. And in exchange, he gave 500 war elephants to his Greek foes, and probably married one of Emperor Seleucus's daughters. This encounter with the Greeks led to a visit by the Seleucid ambassador Megasthenes, who gives us the only real account of Chandragupta's capital city at Pataliputra. Megasthenes tells us that the grand city was surrounded by 21 miles of walls, with almost 600 towers and 60 gates. He describes the high position of Brahmins in Chandragupta's court, and his system of food distribution where farmers gave a quarter of their crop to the state, which Chandragupta could use to feed his armies. What we do know is that Chandragupta and his son, Bindusara, pushed the borders of the empire to almost the entirety of India. By doing so, the Mauryan Empire became the first state to unify most of India under a single power. The only regions that weren't conquered were the Kalinga region, modern-day Odisha, and some parts of northern Andhra Pradesh. The empire reached its greatest height under the rule of Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka the Great. Ashoka began his reign by playing to the military might of the Mauryan Empire. He led a campaign against the state of Kalinga in the east, that supposedly led to the deaths of almost 250,000 people. Seeing this destruction changed Ashoka, he was horrified at the bloodshed and his own role in it. And after 261 BC, he swore off war altogether and dedicated himself absolutely to Buddhism and the ideals of nonviolence. This brought an end to the Mauryan conquest phase, and Ashoka spent the rest of his reign regretting his past violence and working to be a devout Buddhist ruler. Ashoka raised pillars inscribed with his edicts across his empire, which provide us with a wealth of information on his reign. Of course, these edicts trumpet his achievements, but he also uses them to confess his past sins and explain how he will atone for them. He describes establishing hospitals and wells for the common people and patronizing Buddhist temples. In one inscription, he describes how he ordered banyan trees to be planted along the roads so travelers could have shade. He also made a pilgrimage to the Bodhi tree and ordered the first temples to be built where the Mahabodhi temple now stands. Ashoka is one of the most popular Indian historical figures, and it's easy to see why. Not only was he a good ruler who provided for his people, but he was a good person who recognized his own mistakes and dedicated his life to correcting them. Ashoka would have 4 official sons and 1 daughter from his multiple wives. His first son would become a Buddhist monk, revoking his right to the throne, so his second son, Kunala, became the crowned prince. However, one of Ashoka's wives, Queen Tishiraksha, had become jealous of Kunala's influence and intelligence, secretly plotting to have him blinded. One day, the queen forged a royal order from Ashoka instructing officials in Takshashila to blind the prince. Soon after, the prince's eyes were gouged out, disqualifying him from becoming king as he couldn't lead an army anymore. The son of Kunala and grandson of Ashoka, Samprati, was considered the next successor. However, he was just a baby. King Ashoka the Great died in 232 BC, but Samprati was still too young, leaving Ashoka's other grandson Dasharatha Maurya to take the throne from 232 to 224 BC. After the death of Dasharatha, Samprati took the throne of the Maurya dynasty from 224 BC to 215 BC. However, since the death of Ashoka, the empire had become much weaker due to its large size and its non-violence policy. After Samprati's death, 4 more emperors ruled the Mauryan Empire. Around 185 BC, the last emperor was assassinated by Pushyamitra Shunga, one of his own generals who went on to establish the Shunga Empire. What remained of the Mauryan Empire fragmented, and no empire would unify most of India again for centuries. The Shunga Empire was established in Magadha by Pushyamitra Shunga, ruled for 36 years, and was succeeded by his son Agnimitra, 149 BC to 141 BC. There were 10 Shunga rulers. However, after the death of Agnimitra, the second king of the dynasty, the empire rapidly disintegrated. This was mostly due to the constant fighting and wars. The Shunga fought the Kalinga, the Panchalas, and the Indo-Greek kingdom in the Shunga-Greek War after Greek king Demetrius took over the Kabul Valley and wanted to invade further into the subcontinent. After Agnimitra, there were a total of 4 kings from 141 BC to 73 BC. And Devabhuti, the last Shunga emperor, was assassinated by his minister, Vasudeva Kanva, who thereafter established his Kanva dynasty 73 BC to 28 BC. The 500 years following the collapse of the Mauryan Empire in 185 BC has been described as a dark age. The already sparse historical record dried up yet again, with entire kingdoms rising and falling without leaving enough information. What we do have doesn't paint a rosy picture. India split into numerous small kingdoms once again and faced waves of foreign incursions. The first of these came within a few years of the Mauryan collapse, when Greek invaders from the Central Asian kingdom of Bactria conquered much of northern India. and even sacked the old Mauryan capital of Pataliputra. The Greeks withdrew after a while, but after them, waves of Scythians known as the Saka invaded, conquering much of northwest India and modern Pakistan before they were conquered themselves by yet another Central Asian migratory group, the Ujai. The Yuezhi later founded the Kushan Kingdom, one of the most powerful contemporary dynasties, with the help of Kujula Kadphises in 25 AD along with the Satavahana Empire. The Kushan Kingdom dominated modern-day Pakistan, Punjab, and Afghanistan, but despite their foreign origins, they proved quite beneficial to native Indian culture. Their emperors were patrons, and eventually converts to Hinduism, and they grew rich and powerful from the Indian Ocean trade going through their ports. The Kushan Empire probably became the first major Indian state to meet a Chinese army on the battlefield, with the forces of Emperor Kanishka encountering the army of General Pan Chao somewhere in Central Asia, which Kanishka apparently lost and was forced to pay tribute to the Chinese emperor. Elsewhere in India, this was anything but a dark age. In the Deccan, the Satavahana dynasty emerged around the time of the fall of the Mauryans and ruled a large chunk of central India until the 3rd century. In this dynasty, 30 kings ruled India for about 400 years. At different times, their rule extended to parts of modern Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and Karnataka. The first king was Samukha, however, the peak of the dynasty was in the era of Gautamiputra Satakarni, who removed the Saka dynasty completely from southwest India and took control of the world's most important ports, like Brigukacha, Kalyan, and Shorparaka at the time, flourishing for the international trading of luxury goods, silk, and spices. According to the Roman author Pliny, the Satavahanas could muster an army of 100,000 men, which they used in prolonged warfare with invading Scythians. Romans like Pliny were in a position to comment on Indian affairs because of the trade that was flourishing in this period. According to the geographer Strabo, over 100 Roman ships headed to India at the turn of the millennium, and this trade only increased under subsequent emperors. Coins from numerous Roman emperors, including Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, have been found across India, and Roman sources speak of pepper, pearls, and other treasures brought into the empire from their Indian trading partners. India's connections also went east, especially to China. On top of the trade that flourished through Central Asian routes, travelers were moving through this period, especially Buddhist monks who brought the faith to China in these centuries. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, Indian pottery, textiles, and coins from this period have been found in cities, and even tombs from Malaysia to Thailand. Clearly, the rest of the world didn't think India was in some sort of dark age, and India became an important trade partner, an intermediary with much of the world, with huge amounts of wealth and people flowing into and through the subcontinent. It was certainly a period of prosperity for southern India. Dominated by Tamil culture and language, southern India in this period is often called Tamilakam, literally home of the Tamil. Tamilakam covered today's Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Puducherry, Lakshadweep, and southern parts of Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka, and this period was one of significant cultural and political growth. Tamil culture was still very distinct from the culture of northern India. The earliest Tamil literature are Sangam poems, which were produced between the 3rd century BC and 3rd century CE, and focused on topics like romance and war. While these poems can be beautiful in their own right, they also give us a glimpse into how Tamil society worked. For example, it appears that the Varna caste system wasn't yet practiced in the south by this point, despite being centuries old in the north. There's different religious ideas, such as the idea of Ananku, which are a sort of magical force or spirit attached to objects or people. Gender relations were also quite different, with women being more visible and having a greater variety of jobs. There's even reference to kings using female bodyguards. Sangam literature makes reference to people whose presence was seen as inherently polluting or corrupting to others. For example, in the Akarakavai, water touched by a person classified as pulaya is considered unfit for drinking for most people of any social status. and other texts speak of untouchables who would pollute people merely by touch. Politically, Tamilakam was dominated by three powerful dynasties, named the Chera, the Chola, and the Pandyas. These three dynasties were known as the Muvantar, or three-crowned rulers, and would vie for power over Tamilakam for most of the next 1,000 years, with power shifting from one to the other over that time. The conflicts between these dynasties are a common feature in Sangam literature, but their political divisions didn't fracture the cultural and linguistic similarities of their Tamil populations. The Pandyas were the most dominant in this period. There's references to them on pillars established by Emperor Ashoka, and they seem to have kept a position of relative dominance in their territory long after the Mauryans were gone. They made their capital as Madurai, which, thanks to the patronage of the Pandya rulers, became the epicenter of Sangam scholars and literature production. Meanwhile, after the fall of the Satavahanas, the Deccan came under the rule of the Vakatikas. Ruling from around the 3rd to the 6th century, the Vakatikas were a very traditionalist dynasty. Their rulers regularly invoked ancient ideas and performed old Vedic rituals to legitimize their kingship. For example, the second Vakatika king, Pravarasena, performed the Ashvamedha horse sacrifice at least 4 times during his reign. A later king, Prithivishena, prided himself on his wisdom and sound judgment as a ruler. Probably the most famous legacy of the Vakatikas are the Ajanta caves. These are 30 Buddhist cave monuments carved into the side of a cliff in the modern Aurangabad district of Maharashtra state. The first wave of construction there actually occurred under the Satavahanas, but a second wave of construction under the Vakatikas did most of the work we can see today. These cave monuments served as sanctuaries, shrines, and monasteries for the Mahayana Buddhist monks, and are richly decorated with carvings and engravings that are some of the finest examples of ancient Buddhist art that survive. The Vakatikas probably also started work on the Ellora caves in the same region, which are a similarly impressive collection of Buddhist holy sites cut into the side of a cliff, although construction there continued for centuries after the Vakatikas were gone. Clearly, the Vakatika dynasty was powerful and important, which eventually earned them marriage alliances with the greatest power of classical India, the Guptas. The Gupta Empire emerged in the early 4th century, but historians aren't even sure exactly where they came from. What we do know is that starting in the 4th century, they extended their control over the majority of northern and eastern India, and wielded significant influence beyond those borders. The Guptas pioneered a model of imperial power that saw emperors exercising direct control over the empire's core regions, while allowing regional rulers a lot of freedom so long as they swore loyalty to the center. The third Gupta ruler, named Chandragupta I, no relation to Chandragupta Maurya, laid the foundations of their empire and took up the Gupta imperial title of Maharajadhiraj, which elevated him above all others. Regional governors oversaw provinces known as deshas, or buktis, and some of these governors claimed titles once reserved for royalty, like Maharaja. In a land as large and diverse as India, this approach to ruling was much better suited than a top-down approach like that of the Romans. His son, Samudragupta, expanded the empire further, leading conquests into the upper Ganga Valley, and even conquering the ancient Magadha imperial capital of Pataliputra. Inscriptions name a long list of kings that he subdued through battle, but Indian historical records being as thin as they are, historians can't agree on who many of these kings were, or what areas exactly the Guptas controlled. Later rulers like Chandragupta II continued these conquests into Bengal and the Punjab, and it was the Guptas who finally defeated the Saka Scythians and drove them out of their Indian territory in the northwest. We do know that not every area was taken by arms. For example, some of the rulers of Assam chose to bend the knee peacefully and stayed in power while giving tribute to the Guptas. The Guptas never controlled the Deccan or southern India, but they did have strong relations with the Vakatikas through marriage, and sources indicate that rulers as far as Sri Lanka, while not under Gupta control, acknowledged them as the supreme power in the region. The Gupta period was one of peace, stability, and propensity that has earned it the nickname of the Golden Age of India. It was a time of religious, artistic, and scientific innovation, and much of that was driven by the legendary scholars of Nalanda. Nalanda in modern-day Bihar was a Buddhist Mahavihara, founded by the Guptas, which became one of the world's greatest centers of learning. While the institution itself was Buddhist, it was patronized by non-Buddhists too, with gifts of wealth, supplies, and land flowing in to support the scholars. Nalanda's scholars specialized in a number of subjects. Naturally, many of its achievements were rooted in Buddhism, with Nalanda's scholars penning influential commentaries and philosophical works that are still in use today. For example, the writings of the scholar Dignaga are the foundation texts for what is broadly called Buddhist logic, which is still at the heart of Buddhist theology and philosophy today. As well as the mandatory studies in Mahayana Buddhism, scholars could study anything from the Vedas to medicine to astronomy within its walls. Some gifted scholars would become adept in multiple fields, and few were so talented as Aryabhata. Aryabhata lived in the 5th and 6th centuries and specialized in the fields of astronomy and mathematics. His great astronomical work, the Aryabhatiya, is the only original work that survives, in which he correctly deduces the nature of eclipses and the Earth's rotation, among other things. To do so, he relied on complex mathematical equations, a field where he also made great strides. For example, he was one of the first Indian mathematicians to correctly approximate the value of pi to 3.1416, and might have been one of the first people in history to deduce that pi was an irrational number. Aryabhata's observations on trigonometry were also influential, and he's often credited with discovering the sine and cosine functions, which got their European names by translating into Latin the Arabic versions of Aryabhata's work. There was also Varahamihira, another eminent mathematician, whose claim to fame is being the earliest datable scholar to represent zero as a symbol and as a number. The concept of zero for mathematical use was itself a much earlier Indian invention. The Guptas were also the first major empire in history with Hinduism as their main religion. Hinduism is the world's oldest living religion, originating over 3,000 years ago from the Vedas. The most important Hindu deities are those of the Trimurti, who represent the cosmic forces of creation, preservation, and destruction. Brahma represents creation, responsible for bringing the universe into existence. By far, the most popular of this trio is Vishnu. Vishnu represents preservation and is worshipped as the supreme deity by the vast majority of Hindus today. Vishnu is responsible for maintaining the order of the universe. He appeared first in the Rig Veda, but gained prominence over time and supplanted all others. He's usually depicted as a blue-skinned man with 4 arms, each holding a symbolic object. Preserving the balance of the world sometimes requires Vishnu to take the form of avatars, walking the earth in the guise of a human or human-like figure. Probably the best-known avatar is Krishna, who is often worshipped as a deity in his own right and is usually depicted as a blue-skinned man or child. Then there's Shiva, who traditionally represents destruction. This isn't a negative association at all, and destruction is seen as a necessary and integral part of creation and preservation. The Gupta Empire marked a golden age for Hinduism, with rulers promoting Sanskrit learning, codifying sacred text, and constructing the first grand stone temples that established lasting traditions of Hindu art, architecture, and worship. The Gupta period left a legacy that those who came after them could be thankful for. Both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata reached their recognizable modern state that we see them in today. They were originally written in Sanskrit, but have since been translated into almost every language on Earth. These stories are massive. They're several times longer than the combined works of Homer, and longer even than the Bible and Quran combined. Everyone in India will know some of the stories and characters from these works. And they're some of the most important cultural ties that all of India share. The Mahabharata tells the story of a great war between 2 families, the Kauravas and Pandavas. Our heroes, the Pandava brothers, lose their kingdoms to their cousins the Kauravas in a dice game. and after being forced to wander the wilderness for 13 years, they returned to wage an epic war to reclaim their rightful heritage. This conflict, known as the Kurukshetra War, pits heroes against heroes on both sides. The standout character of the text is Arjuna. Arjuna is a gifted warrior who wields a divine bow and is almost unmatched on the battlefield. Arjuna is capable of many incredible feats. For instance, in one passage, he slays the warrior Jayadratha by shooting him so hard that the arrow decapitates him, carries the head over a mountain back to Jayadratha's home, and lands in his father's lap while he's praying. The sight of his son's head in his lap is too much to bear, and Jayadratha's father's own head explodes in shock. We could spend 10 videos narrating the events of the Mahabharata and still not cover everything. Some in India believe those events are also historical, as artifacts from the relevant period are found in those locations. The Gupta Empire had reached a golden age where the benefits would reach even the common people. According to the Chinese monk Fashion, who visited the Gupta Empire around 415 CE, the noble families established charity houses and hospitals. All the poor, orphans, widowers, childless men, cripples, and the sick go to those houses and get help, and doctors treat their conditions. They get the food and medicines they need, and when they're better, they're able to leave on their own. But it wasn't a golden age for everyone. Women also lost status and freedom in this period. In Vedic times, women had been allowed to study the Vedas and had more freedom to visit temples, which vanished with the consolidation of modern Hinduism in the Gupta period. This changing attitude to women is seen in the new belief that women could only achieve liberation from the cycle of life and death by being reborn into a male body first. The custom of sati, or window burning, where widows would throw themselves onto their husband's funeral pyre, also became more common in this period. It has existed as a concept before, but it was somewhat normalized during the Gupta period. Speaking of women and gender relations, one of the most famous Indian texts was written in this period, a sutra or manual on courtship, relationships, and lovemaking known as the Kamasutra. Today, the name Kamasutra is automatically associated with the sections of the work dealing with sexual intercourse. While the text does deal with that topic, most of the text isn't about sex, but more about relationships and social expectations. As a result, it's an incredibly valuable source of information for family and married life. The Kamasutra spends much more time discussing the ordinary domestic duties of spouses than it does on the conjugal ones. The Kamasutra calls for wives to be obedient servants, to keep their house clean and presentable, and to be a good host when her husband brings guests over. It outlines the modesty expected from women when their husbands are away, and the chastity demanded from widows. All of these align with the more controlled role of women that emerged in this period. But the Kamasutra also shows how women had powers and freedoms in other aspects. For example, according to the Kamasutra, it was the women who managed the household's finances, and if they were wealthy, managed the servants. Depending on the household, women could be expected to be knowledgeable on matters of agriculture, animal husbandry, weaving, or other productive enterprise that she'd be expected to practice. The Kamasutra is also a philosophical text. It delves into the nature of love and the proper pursuit of pleasure. Saturated as it is in Hindu ideas, it doesn't reject physical pleasure entirely like Buddhism, but instead places it in the proper context of a loving marriage, where both spouses understand and fulfill the duties expected of them. Like so many other empires, there was no single moment where it all came to an end. The collapse of the Gupta Empire played out over several decades as shifting social order strained the now centuries-old structures the empire rested upon. The empire's strengths became its weakness. The powerful regional rulers began breaking away from the late 5th century. Meanwhile, foreign invaders, such as the Huns, sapped the empire's resources and chipped away at the weakly held regions in northern and western India. In the first decades of the 6th century, waves of serious invasions allowed the Huns to overrun much of the continent. Details of these conflicts are sparse, but it appears that the combined efforts of the remaining Gupta Empire and several other Indian kingdoms were finally able to drive them back. But the Guptas would never regain all the territory or power they lost. The last Gupta emperor we know of ruled in the 540s. After that, they vanish. Along with them went the golden age of Indian art and literature and the stability of the trade that had tied India and much of the surrounding world together. Once again, a period of relative unification for India gave way to regional fragmentation. For the next few centuries of Indian history, there was a period of fluctuating kingdoms and more intense warfare than India had ever seen before. First on the list of post-Gupta Indian empires was that of the Pushyabhuti. The Pushyabhuti established themselves in Punjab and extended their influence to much of northern India. Its first three kings were nothing notable, but it's the fourth king, Harsha, who really mattered. Harsha came to power at just 16 following the betrayal and murder of his elder brother and brother-in-law by an alliance of rival kings. Harsha narrowly saved his sister from committing sati on the pyre of her dead husband, and went on to subdue the neighboring kings and republics from Punjab to central India. He was a talented military leader, but Harsha was even more adept at peaceful governance. According to our sources, he was tolerant of Hindus and Buddhists, patronizing Brahmins and Buddhist monks alike. And he spent time every day studying his religious texts. He was something of an itinerant emperor who preferred to be traveling around his kingdom listening to his subjects, and dealing with regional issues hands-on than lazing around in a palace. As well as being a patron of the arts, Harsha was also said to have written at least 3 plays himself. One, a religious biography of a Buddhist monk, and the other 2, romantic comedies. He was also said to be a talented lute player. The reason we know so much about Harsha is largely thanks to his biographer, Banabhatta, who penned India's oldest surviving biography about his royal patron. Banabhatta himself is an interesting character. After a rough childhood where both his parents died young, he and his brothers traveled to India with an entourage of dancers, poets, musicians, and actors, where he gained a reputation as a party animal. As Banabhatta tells it, he'd put those days behind him by the time Harsha summoned him to the court, where the king reprimanded him for his old behavior. But after Banabhatta proved to the king that he was a changed man, Harsha welcomed him into the royal court, and he became one of his most trusted friends. Another source from Harsha's reign comes from the Chinese monk Xuanzang, who visited Harsha's court and praised his virtuous rule and patronage of Buddhist temples. This was the same Xuanzang whose travels were mythologized in the popular Chinese novel Journey to the West. Harsha also sent an ambassador to visit the Tang Emperor of China, who sent diplomatic missions back in return, marking some of the earliest formal diplomatic contact between the two great civilizations. Unfortunately, Harsha died without heirs in 647, and his empire collapsed into warring kingdoms. The other noteworthy post-Gupta state was the Chalukya Empire of the Deccan. Formed in the mid-6th century as Gupta power collapsed, the Chalukyas ruled out of Badami and have earned a reputation as powerful warrior kings. Much of their fame owes to one man, Pulakeshin II. Pulakeshin was only a child when his father died in 592, so power was wielded by his uncle Mangalisha. Our sources are ambiguous on the details, but it seems that Mangalisha tried to seize the throne from his nephew. When the young Pulakeshin came of age, he appears to have waged a civil war against his uncle, and ultimately defeated him to claim his rightful throne by 610. What followed was the reign of one of India's greatest military leaders. After suppressing rebellions that had broken out during the struggle with his uncle, Pulakeshin defeated numerous kingdoms in the Karnataka region and made inroads to the north, east, south, and to the western coast. In 619, Pulakeshin personally led an army north to wage war with King Harsha and defeated him at the Battle of Narmada. The victories continued for the next 2 decades as Pulakeshin extended his control. One of his most historic victories was not offensive but defensive when Pulakeshin's navy successfully repelled an Arab navy sent under the authority of the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab to capture the city of Tana near Mumbai. Pulakeshin enjoyed decades of victory, but it would come to an end when he crossed blades with the Pallavas to the south. They fought a series of battles in the late 630s and early 640s, which led the Pallava king Narasimhavarman I to invade Chalukya and capture their capital of Vadapi. Ever the warrior, Pulakeshin fought to the last, but was slain by the invading Pallavas. The Chalukyas did eventually get their revenge, recapturing their capital in the 650s and capturing the Pallava capital at Kanchipuram in the 730s. However, the Chalukyas were soon overthrown by one of their vassals, the Rashtrakuta, in 753, spelling the end of the first but not last Chalukya dynasty. Pulakeshin's battle with the forces of Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab marked the first major encounter between Islamic and Indian powers, beginning the story of a long and complicated relationship between Islam and India. Islam burst onto the scene in the early 7th century, and Muslims swiftly established their control from North Africa to Persia. They toppled the Sultanate Empire, which put them on the border of what were then considered Indian kingdoms in modern Afghanistan and Pakistan. Arab naval expeditions targeted India unsuccessfully as early as 636, but land invasions would prove more successful. The seminal example was Sindh in modern-day Pakistan. The region was considered Indian before the arrival of Islam and was under the control of the Brahmin dynasty. Arab raids on the region began almost immediately after Muhammad's death and continued into the 640s. But it wasn't until 712 that an army of the Umayyad Caliphate finally conquered the region, placing Sindh fully under Muslim control. Today, many Pakistanis consider this an important moment in the formation of their nation. Over the following decades, Islam would be adopted by the majority of the population, which remains Muslim to this day. Control of Sindh was the first time that Muslims held power over a traditionally Indian population. But it would be wrong to characterize the arrival of Islam purely as a phenomenon of conflict. Trade and travel were just as important in the early encounters between Islam and India. Arab traders were welcomed into Indian ports, and Indian rulers were generally tolerant of Muslim religion. The Rashtrakutas, who controlled many of the ports along the west coast, were happy to allow Muslim communities to settle in the cities and establish mosques. As we'll see as we go through this period, Muslim travelers went far and wide in India, and the writings of these travelers are some of the most valuable source material on this period. Likewise, Sindh was still home to communities of Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains for centuries under Muslim rule, and Indian ships were a common sight in Muslim ports. It can be easy to view interaction between Islam and India purely through the lens of conflict and invasion, and those issues won't be absent from the story going forward, but cooperation and tolerance were and remain just as important in the history of Islam in India. Northern India had long been home to powerful empires, and in the vacuum left behind by the Guptas, 3 empires emerged who became locked in a series of conflicts for control of northern India and the historic city of Kannauj, known as the Tripartite Struggle, or the Kannauj Triangle Wars. These empires were those of the Pallavas, the Pratiharas, and the Rashtrakutas. All 3 empires emerged in the 750s and were well established in their own core regions. The Pratiharas were based in Gujarat and Rajasthan and made a name for themselves defending against Muslim incursions for Sindh. One Arab chronicler speaking of the Pratihara emperor Mihira Bhoja wrote that, "Among the princes of India, there is no greater foe of Islam than he." The Rashtrakutas were the dominant power in the Deccan after overthrowing the Chalukyas. Unlike their Pratihara neighbors, they were much more tolerant of Islam, permitting preachers and mosques in their cities as well as extensive trade with the Muslim world. It's no surprise that accounts from Arab travelers are much more positive on the Rashtrakutas. Stretching across beyond the Deccan from north to south, they were the largest of the 3 empires. Last but not least, the Pallavas made their homes in Bengal. The Pallavas were Buddhists. Indeed, they would end up being history's last Buddhist imperial power, and they were renowned as much for their diplomacy and scholarship as their military talents. The Pallavas had strong relations with Southeast Asia, with the Arab world, and especially with the Buddhist Tibetan Empire, and acted as a magnet for travelers, traders, and scholars from these regions. The days of the tripartite struggle ended in the late 10th century, with the fragmentation of the Pratiharas and Rashtrakutas into numerous smaller kingdoms and lesser empires. The Palas proved more durable and endured in some form until the middle of the 12th century. In Tamil country, the Pallavas dominated for much of the second half of the first millennium, but in the end, the old Muvantar dynasties reasserted themselves, and this time it was the Cholas' turn to rule. The Chola Empire was founded by King Vijayalaya, who rebelled against his Pallava overlords, captured the Pallava capital of Kanchi, and overthrew the dynasty in 893. Over the following centuries, the Cholas united more of southern India under the same banner than any power before them, but they also expanded their empire beyond India, becoming one of the only Indian powers to build a foreign empire. Under King Rajaraja I, the Chola conquered northern Sri Lanka and the Maldives, but it was his son Rajendra I who saw the greatest expansion. Rajendra completed the conquest of the rest of Sri Lanka and then went east, conquering territory in the Malay archipelago, Sumatra, and even Thailand. In 1022, one of Rajendra's generals led another expedition across the mainland into Bengal, where they defeated several regional kings there, many of them vassals of the Pala Empire, which led Rajendra to adopt the title Gongai Konda Chola, the Chola who conquered the Ganga. The Cholas dominated all of Southeast Asia as a result, and the Bay of Bengal has been described as a Chola lake in this period for how much power they had over it. The 11th and 12th centuries were the heights of Chola power. Traders from as far as China in the east and Egypt in the west found their way to Chola ports. All of this trade gave them the money to pay for their massive army, and in times of war, the trading vessels could be repurposed as warships, giving the Chola the largest navy yet seen in India. The Cholas didn't neglect trade over land either, with the Cholas constructing extensive road networks to support overland trade. Naturally, a powerful merchant class arose, and the guilds representing the various industries that supplied the goods the Cholas traded became powerful social institutions. The Chola rulers also used this wealth to fund whole new cities, temples, and legions of artists. Clearly, early medieval India was a place of political change, with kingdoms and empires rising and falling constantly. However, despite this political division, it's clear that India was developing a set of common beliefs, practices, behaviors, and ideas that were shared across the political divisions. Firstly, power and politics behaved much in the same way in the various kingdoms. All of the empires were organized around a central monarch, who claimed similar titles like Maharaja, and a warrior nobility who presided over regions governed by largely autonomous local rulers, who swore loyalty to the emperor. Power was generally hereditary from father to son, although there were some exceptions. For example, the first Pala ruler, named Gopala, was elected by his fellow nobles, while in the Rashtrakuta Empire, it was not uncommon for elder sons to be passed over for inheritance if younger sons demonstrated superior leadership qualities. Many empires employed similar militaries that relied, as Indian warfare long had, on a combination of infantry, cavalry, and elephants. Different empires might have their specializations. The Palas were known for their elephants, the Pratiharas were legendary for their cavalry, and the Cholas had their unrivaled navy. But the attitudes and mechanics of warfare were almost identical no matter who was fighting. Sources indicate that medieval India made liberal use of mercenaries drawn from a wide range of different peoples to support their core armies, which brought Indians from across the subcontinent together on the battlefields. As the medieval age rolled on, Islamic powers began encroaching into India. For most of the next 1,000 years, much of India would come to be ruled by Muslims. The Muslim Ghaznavid Empire was one of the first in this line. In 1001, its ruler Mahmud Ghazni swore to wage jihad against India every year of his life to subdue the Hindu kings. Marching out from his territory in Afghanistan, Ghazni defeated the Hindu ruler of Kabul, Jayapala, and swiftly moved through modern-day Pakistan, capturing Lahore in 1021 and reaching India by 1030. Although Ghazni's conquests would mostly slip away after his death, The Ghurids were the next major power, overthrowing the ailing Ghaznavids in 1186 and launching a full invasion of India in 1191 under Muhammad of Ghor. Over the following years, Muhammad's forces conquered the Ganga Valley, reaching as far as Lower Bengal in 1203. His conquests in India might have continued had he not been distracted by conflicts in Central Asia in the last years of his reign. After successfully quelling them, Muhammad was returning to Delhi via Pakistan when he was assassinated near modern-day Sahawa while conducting evening prayers. In the chaos, one of his generals and a former slave named Qutb-ud-Din Aibak established himself as a sultan in Delhi, starting the age of one of India's great Muslim powers, the Delhi Sultanate. The Delhi Sultanate would last for 300 years in 5 separate dynasties, all of whom would control different territories at different times. However, they all shared some common factors. Obviously, they ruled out of Delhi, they were all Muslim, and they all claimed descent from outside of India. The first dynasty of Qutb-ud-Din Aibak was dubbed the Slave Dynasty, or Mamluk Dynasty to use the contemporary term. It stood from 1206 to 1290 and was able to secure control over all of northern India, stretching from Pakistan to Bengal. The Mamluks had the unenviable task of confronting the Mughal Empire, which began its expansion in this period. Thankfully for them, the Mongols never launched a true invasion of India, but waves of raids occupied much of the Mamluk dynasty's military and economic resources throughout the latter half of the 13th century. The Mamluk dynasty came to an end when court intrigue and poisoning left only a 5-year-old boy to rule, who was quickly deposed by one of his generals, Jalal-ud-Din. His Khilji dynasty would only last for 30 years. But it has the distinction of having one of the worst rulers in Indian history. Jalal-ud-Din's nephew, Al-Din, was about as awful as a person could be. While still serving under his uncle, Al-Din took an army of several thousand men south into the Deccan and told the local rulers that he was fleeing his uncle's court for fear of persecution. The ruler of Daulatabad opened his gates to him, only for Al-Din to immediately sack the city and carry off its loot. Al-Din then sent a message to his uncle inviting him to come and celebrate the victory, which Jalal-ud-Din did, only for Al-Din to murder him and seize power for himself. Al-Din's rule was one of tyranny and violence. He continued to conquer and pillage cities, such as Warangal, and added new territories like Gujarat to his empire. He was paranoid and harsh, seeing enemies everywhere in his court and family, which led him to torture and execute many of them. He cracked down on Hindu temples, which earned him many enemies in his Hindu-majority empire. But he infuriated Muslims too when he admitted 30,000 Mongol Muslim converts to settle in his territory, only to massacre them down to every last woman and child. When he finally died in 1316, his sons and generals waged a brutal civil war. Eager to erase all legacy of Al-Din, the victorious general Dapalpur Ghiyath al-Din Tughlaq made sure to behead any of the remaining members of the Khilji line and establish his own Tughlaq dynasty. The Tughlaqs weren't much of an improvement though. They heavily discriminated against Hindus and staffed their top posts exclusively with Muslims, which earned them dozens of rebellions. The second Tughlaq ruler, Muhammad, also launched a disastrous invasion of the Yuan dynasty in China, with 100,000 men who got lost and died in the Himalayas. All of this cost the Sultanate immensely in money and food, which led to economic collapse and famine. As the Tughlaq dynasty declined in the mid-14th century, regions further from Delhi began to break off. Muslim rulers in the northern Deccan broke off to form the Bahmani Sultanate, while Hindu nobles in the south formed the Vijayanagara Empire. The Bahmani symbolized the style of Muslim kingdom that had become common in India over the previous 300 years. They were ruled by a Muslim aristocracy, who maintained a tolerant policy to the Hindu population. The Bahmani were keen to welcome immigrants from the Muslim world to act as mercenaries, administrators, and scholars. These Westerners, as they were called, became a useful asset to the empire. They also employed a greater use of mobile cavalry that gave them an edge over Indian rivals, and were probably the first power to deploy gunpowder weapons on the subcontinent. Meanwhile, Vijayanagara followed in the older Hindu tradition of kingship. Both empires shared a border along the Krishna River and spent much of their history locked in open warfare and rivalry. They fought 4 major wars and numerous smaller skirmishes over their history, which the Bahmani generally won, forcing the Vijayanagara to pay tribute to them several times, although never for very long. Sometimes war went the other way, like in 1378 when the Vijayanagara seized upon the assassination of the Bahmani Sultan by a disgruntled servant to invade along the coast and capture key ports including Goa. The Bahmani got their revenge in 1398 when its armies, under Feroz Shah Bahmani, invaded Vijayanagara, besieged their capital, and forced them to pay tribute once again. Their most interesting war came in 1406 when the Vijayanagara ruler, Deva Raya, who had just won a power struggle against his brothers for the throne, was told about a daughter of a goldsmith whose beauty was without equal. Deva Raya was captivated and proposed to the girl, but she rejected him. She didn't want to marry him because, first, she was a Muslim and he was a Hindu, and second, because she knew about the practice of sati. And given that Deva Raya had just killed many of his brothers, she feared that she'd only be signing herself up to be burned when someone else deposed him in turn. Deva Raya was outraged that anyone would reject him and marched his armies north to take the girl by force. The girl and her father fled north to the Bahmani, but this didn't stop Deva Raya's pursuit, so naturally the Bahmani Sultan marched to meet him. The appropriately named War of the Goldsmith's Daughter lasted for several months until the Bahmani armies forced Deva Raya to retreat. In the resulting treaty, the Bahmani Sultan demanded one of Roya's daughters as a bride and married the goldsmith's daughter to his son. It was humiliating, but it bought a few years of peace before the two empires started killing each other again. Meanwhile, the Delhi sultans continued to slip into decline. The Tughlaq dynasty was already on its last legs when in 1398, the infamous Mongol conqueror Timur, or Tamerlane, invaded. His brutal 5-day sacking of Delhi crippled the city for a century. Tughlaqs limped to a quiet end 15 years later. They were followed by the Saids, heirs to one of Timur's Indian vassals. But with Timur gone and northern India decimated by his invasion, they could never wield much power. They were easy pickings then for the Lodi of Afghanistan to invade in 1451 and establish themselves as the fifth and final dynasty of the Sultanate. Things weren't much better for Vijayanagara and Bahmani either. Both empires were torn by internal strife and regional rebellions that prevented them even going to war much in the 16th century. Vijayanagara enjoyed a brief period of ascendance under Deva Raya II, reaching its greatest height during his reign with control of all of southern India up to the Krishna River, down to Tamil country, and even receiving tribute from Sri Lanka. But this golden period was disrupted by more rebellions and internal strife in the later 15th century. The Bahmani had it even worse. Hindu Rajput nobles became increasingly unhappy with Muslim rule, and by the 16th century were in a state of near perpetual rebellion. This became too much for the Bahmani Sultanate, and in 1525 it fractured into 5 separate kingdoms. With the Bahmani gone, Delhi reduced to a local power, and Vijayanagara preoccupied with internal issues, it was the perfect time for ambitious foreign conquerors to arrive. Sweeping in from Central Asia, blending Turkic-Mongol warrior culture with Persian administration and an Islamic faith, the Mughals were about to make a triumphant entrance into Indian history. Almost simultaneously, new ships began appearing in the ports of Western India, carrying strangers from the distant lands of Europe. The Mughals, or Mongols, had made intermittent appearances in India since the days of Genghis Khan, and Timur was technically considered one. However, the Mughals who arrived in 1526 would not be short-lived raiders, but the founders of one of India's greatest pre-modern empires. The Mughals came into India via Afghanistan under the leadership of Babur, who claimed direct descent from both Genghis Khan and Timur. With his powerful army, Babur defeated the Lodi Sultan of Delhi at the Battle of Panipat in 1526 and established himself as the ruler of northern India. Babur was a warrior but also a scholar. He was literate and wrote about his own impressions of India. He was fond of its landscape and marveled at its plants and animals, but he showed little interest in the Indians themselves. He constructed palaces that were basically enclaves of Persian culture isolated from the surrounding native Indians with whom he barely interacted. But Babur's Mughal Empire was short-lived. After his death, his empire was partitioned between his sons in the Central Asian tradition. India went to Humayun, but he was not secure in his power before the Pashtun Sher Shah Suri rebelled against him in 1540 and successfully drove the Mughals out of India. Humayun sought help from his brothers, but ultimately didn't get it and had to flee to the Safavids of Persia. The Safavids provided him an army with which he then used to defeat his brothers and claim control of their territory. In 1555, he returned to India with a new army and crushed the Delhi Sultanate at the Battle of Sirhind before reclaiming his father's territories in India. Humayun wouldn't enjoy them for long though. Barely 6 months after retaking India, Humayun tripped down the stairs of his library and hit his head, dying 3 days later. However, his death would be the beginning of a golden age for the Mughals under his young son, Akbar. Akbar was the Ashoka to Babur's Chandragupta. The grandfather may have founded the empire, but the grandson would go down in history as its most famous ruler, renowned for his wisdom, his tolerance, and his virtue. Akbar was just 12 when his father died, so power was wielded by his regent, Bairam Khan. Bairam was a capable administrator and an effective war leader who expanded Mughal control across northern India. However, when time came to hand power over to Akbar, Bairam rebelled. Akbar put down the rebellion but offered mercy to his ally, allowing him to live and undertake a pilgrimage to Mecca. Akbar spent much of his early reign subduing northern and eastern India. Akbar was an innovator on the battlefield, especially with gunpowder, and made possibly the first use of cannons in India on Rajput princes in 1569. The Mughal military would be the first large military force in Indian history to rely mostly on gunpowder weapons. Eventually, he settled on diplomacy to better integrate the Hindu nobility into the empire. He took a Hindu wife and allowed Hindu nobles significant freedom to manage their own affairs if they stayed loyal to him. In most other affairs, Akbar was a big centralizer. He established the administrative structures that would maintain the empire for centuries after him, and he was good at using them. He was renowned as a wise and just ruler who was eager to be involved in running his empire and strived to balance between his deeply held Muslim beliefs and those of the Hindus he ruled. He banned animal sacrifices and stopped widows from being forced to commit sati, but allowed Hindu temples to flourish and was generally happy to allow Hindus to worship as they pleased so long as order was maintained. After 1564, he abolished the jizya tax that non-Muslims were usually obligated to pay to Muslim rulers around the world. And from 1575, he began holding regular debates between religious figures. These debates were legendary, featuring Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Christians, and even Zoroastrians, presenting their beliefs in free and respectful discussion. This toleration was politically useful, and Akbar himself seems to have been genuinely interested in other religions. He also patronized scholars and artists, a tradition that later Mughal rulers would uphold, making the Mughal period one of cultural and scientific flourishing. Akbar died in 1605, but he left behind a strong empire, which would stand for another quarter of a millennium. Great men like Akbar often define history, but the Mughal period offers a glimpse of great women too. Neither India nor the Islamic world saw many female rulers, but a few emerged in India at this time. The Mughals had powerful women of their own too. Akbar's son Jahangir married one such woman, Nur Jahan. The two had fallen in love at a young age, but since Nur Jahan was from a poor family, Akbar wanted Jahangir to marry elsewhere and forced Nur Jahan into a miserable marriage with another man. As soon as Akbar died, though, the new emperor broke up that marriage and married Nur Jahan for himself. Nur Jahan was a shrewd and capable politician who amassed significant power during her husband's reign. She was granted power of the royal seal to give orders and pass decrees, and she was given power to make appointments to government offices. In many ways, Jahangir was the lesser power and Nur Jahan wielded true power at his side. This didn't escape the notice of the Mughal nobility or Jahangir's heir, Shah Jahan. After Jahangir died, Shah Jahan banished Nur Jahan from the court to make way for another woman whose name echoes through history, Mumtaz Mahal. Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal were another love match. They had been engaged to each other as teenagers and married when they were about 20 years old. Over their 26-year marriage, it's said that Shah Jahan did not lie with any of his other wives and kept them purely as political alliances. Shah Jahan trusted her as an advisor, and she was trusted to wield power in court, giving orders to officials and making appointments to important positions. Together, they had 14 children, but Mumtaz Mahal tragically died from birth complications during the last one in 1631. At her death, Shah Jahan was distraught and unable to work or eat for days. Eventually, he decided to give her a monument worthy of his love for her and commissioned his court architect, a man named Ustad Ahmad Lahori, to build her a mausoleum complex just outside of the city of Agra that would bear her name for eternity, the Taj Mahal. It took years and thousands of laborers to complete it, but in 1643, Shah Jahan held the first memorial service there on the 12th anniversary of his wife's death. It took another 10 years to finish the entire complex, but the results speak for themselves. One popular myth claims that Shah Jahan cut off the hands of everyone who worked on it so they couldn't build anything as beautiful, and gouged out their eyes so they couldn't see anything as beautiful, although historians agree this is just a myth. Shah Jahan joined his wife there upon his death in 1648. And since then, the monument has stood as a symbol of Mughal architecture. It was somewhat neglected through the 19th century, but restorations were done in 1908, and today the Taj Mahal attracts millions of tourists every year, standing as an iconic symbol of India's past and present glory. However, change was coming to India. It would happen slowly, but in time, India would be forever changed by the arrival of newcomers from Europe. There had been very little direct interaction between India and Europe since the classical period 1,000 years ago. Trade was usually indirect, with Indian and European goods reaching the other through Arab hands more often than not. Exceptional cases like Marco Polo were few and far between, and the only situations where Indians and Europeans were likely to meet would be in Arab or North African trading hubs. That changed in 1498 when the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa and reached India. Da Gama was welcomed by the local ruler of Calicut, but as curious as the Portuguese were to the Indians had no reason to think of them as anything more than just another group of foreigners there to trade. They were granted permission to establish trade outposts known as factories in several Indian cities, and soon, Indian goods were flowing into European markets, chiefly at Antwerp in Belgium. However, the Indians were quickly made aware of Europe's technological and military advantages. While India had gunpowder and sailing ships, they were not as widespread or advanced as those of the Europeans. When the Mamluk dynasty of Egypt, not to be confused with Delhi's Mamluk dynasty, attempted to attack the Portuguese as punishment for finding a route to India that didn't go through Mamluk territory, the Portuguese crashed them on the island of Diu, near Gujarat, in 1509. In 1510, Portugal turned its guns on the Bijapur Sultanate to capture the city of Goa, which it would hold for the next 450 years. After 1580, King Philip II of newly unified Spain and Portugal chose to focus on the Americas instead, which gave space for other European powers to muscle in on India. The Dutch arrived in 1596 and established the Dutch East India Company, also known as the VOC. but their attention would go mostly to the islands that today make up Indonesia. The French also tried getting to India in the 16th century, but it took until the mid-17th century for them to consistently get there without the ships going missing. Then, of course, there were the British. Jesuit missionary Thomas Stevens became the first known Englishman to reach India only in 1579. He was followed in 1583 by 4 Englishmen who were arrested by the Portuguese and sent as prisoners to their factory in Goa. They escaped and found sanctuary in Akbar's courts. One became a jeweler for the Mughal Emperor, and another joined trading expeditions deeper into the continent. Only one of them, John Newbery, ever returned home, returning to London in 1591 with detailed information on India that would be useful to future travelers. The first English naval expedition departed that same year under Captain James Lancaster, and in 1608, Captain William Hawkins arrived at the court of Emperor Jahangir as the first official envoy of the King of England. Of course, it wasn't diplomacy the British were interested in, but trade. Queen Elizabeth I chartered the East India Company on December 31, 1600, with a mandate and monopoly for British trade in South Asia. The EIC, often simply called the Company, sent trade expeditions to India, Indonesia, China, and Japan in the following years, bringing Britain firmly into the affairs of the region. Naturally, the European powers in India came to blows. Dutch victories over the British in Southeast Asia persuaded Britain to focus fully on the subcontinent. And in 1612, English and Portuguese ships clashed at the Battle of Surat, which became Britain's first major military victory in South Asia, and persuaded the Mughal Emperor to allow the British to establish their first permanent base of operations in India at Surat. The British clearly made an impression on Jahangir, who wrote to King James I promising full protection for all English merchants in his lands and a total ban on rival Portuguese ships using Mughal harbors. Meanwhile, but what had been a foot in the door for the EIC in India would eventually become a boot on its neck. That would take time though, and the presence of the Europeans was mostly a side story for Indians for the 16th and 17th centuries. The Mughal Empire continued pushing south into new territories, reaching its territorial height under Emperor Aurangzeb, but his reign spelled the beginning of the decline of Mughal power as new problems emerged. Aurangzeb spent his early reign dealing with Central Asian raids, which allowed Shivaji Bhonsle to carve out a kingdom of his own in the Deccan, and from the Mughal vassal states to the south, known as the Maratha Kingdom. The Deccan Wars against the Marathas would occupy most of Aurangzeb's military attention for the next 2 decades. In 1674, Shivaji declared himself the ruler of a full Maratha Empire, and it took until after Shivaji's death for Aurangzeb to subdue them, although it didn't last much beyond his own death. The Mughals' famous tolerance also evaporated under Aurangzeb. From the 1670s, he embraced a hardline Islamic approach, which led him to reinstate the jizya for non-Muslims, setting up an Islamic morality police called the Mutasibs, and order several Hindu temples to be demolished and replaced with mosques. His persecution of Hindus permanently alienated many Hindus, but perhaps his harshest persecution fell upon a new religious group that had emerged in the Punjab, calling themselves Sikhs. Sikhism is the youngest of the world's major religions and owes itself to the Punjabi religious leader Guru Nanak. Born into a Hindu family in the Punjab in 1469, he echoed earlier Indian religious visionaries by setting aside his old life following a religious epiphany while meditating when he was 30 years old. Guru Nanak preached a holistic monotheistic creed that he believed could unify all people in worship of a single God. In his words, there is no Hindu, there is no Muslim. Guru Nanak spent the next 40 years of his life traveling on religious pilgrimages known as Udasi to preach his message. When he died on September 22, 1539, he amassed a sizable following that continued to expand after his death, as new gurus stepped up to lead the Sikh community. Sikhism emphasizes the individual's personal relationship with God, and his duty to pursue justice and service to others without any expectation of reward. Like other religions, it warns against destructive behaviors and emotions, chiefly the 5 vices of attachment: ego, greed, lust, and rage. As the religion developed, other practices were added. One of the best known is the traditions of the 5 Ks, where Sikhs are obligated to wear 5 articles of faith to symbolize their devotion. These are the kachera, a type of undergarment, the konga, a wooden comb, a kara, metal bracelet, kesh, uncut hair, and a kirpan, dagger or sword. The Mughals didn't think much of this religious sect at first, but by the time of the 5th guru, Arjan Dev, authorities had started to take notice. Mughal authorities under Emperor Jahangir accused him and other Sikh leaders of fomenting rebellion, and took Arjan into custody and demanded his conversion to Islam. When Arjan refused, he was executed. The execution of Guru Arjan was a landmark moment in Sikh history that began a long struggle with the Mughals and other ruling powers in India. It has been described as a moment of political awakening for the Sikhs that would shape their history for centuries to come. The persecution of the Sikhs was both a symptom and a cause of a wider Mughal decline. The existence of Sikh resistance showed that the Mughals' grip on India was failing, and their harsh response only hardened the resolves of Sikhs to resist them. Aurangzeb found as much upon executing the 9th Guru, Tegh Bahadur, in 1772, which ignited a fierce Sikh rebellion that persisted until after his death. Another major Sikh rebellion under Banda Singh Bahadur erupted in 1709, with the Sikhs successfully taking several cities and winning several battles with the Mughals before Banda was captured. Banda was taken to Delhi in 1716, where Banda, his son, and 2,000 of their followers were brutally blinded, dismembered, flayed, and beheaded in public view. It ended the rebellion, but it all but assured the Sikhs would never forgive or submit to Mughal authority. The empire had numerous other problems too. Akbar's centralization had been a tremendous strength of the empire under capable rulers, but mediocre or disinterested emperors made that centralized system a vulnerability. As central authority decayed, regional leaders asserted themselves. And as Aurangzeb's harsher religious policy continued under his successors, Hindu local rulers began searching for a way out. In 1724, the Nizam of Hyderabad declared his independence, carving off a sizable chunk of the Deccan from Mughal rule. The Awadh went independent the same year under Sadat Ali Khan. Mughal decline wasn't helped by a Persian invasion in 1739 by Nadir Shah. The Mughals were defeated despite having a 6-to-1 numbers advantage over the Persians at the Battle of Karnal, which allowed Nadir Shah to pillage Delhi. There were several more invasions in the following years, with the most destructive one coming from the Duranis of Afghanistan in 1752, when Delhi was brutally sacked, its citizens enslaved, and its temples defiled and smeared with cow blood. With the Mughals on the ropes, the Marathas of the Deccan returned with a vengeance. They had not forgotten their suppression under Aurangzeb, and in the 1740s they stormed out of the Deccan and rapidly expanded across India. Between 1740 and 1761, the Marathas extended their power over Rajasthan, and Karnataka launched multiple military raids into Bengal, captured Orissa in 1755, and in 1757 invaded Delhi. Delhi was still a wreck from multiple previous invasions, and was effectively under the control of Afghan puppet leaders, and it took just 2 weeks for Maratha forces to capture the city. The Marathas were now the largest power in India. This new Maratha Empire differed from the Mughals or the British in that it was more of a confederacy than an empire. Power was wielded from the center by a Peshwa, which is usually translated as Prime Minister in English, but was functionally a hereditary noble. However, practical power was wielded in different parts of the empire by the four great Maratha noble families, who effectively ruled their own pieces of the empire. These were the Bhonsle and Nagpur, the Gaekwads of Baroda, the Okars from Indore, and the Scindias ruling in Gwalior. This decentralization allowed regional interests to be protected, but they would also be fault lines that would pave the way to the collapse of the Marathas. In 1761, the Marathas tried to expand further, but were met by the Afghan Duranis in a massive battle at Paniput in January. This Battle of Paniput was one of the largest battles of the 18th century, with over 100,000 men participating, complete with cavalry, war elephants, and artillery. The Maratha army was defeated with some 30,000 casualties, putting a halt to their expansion. Meanwhile, the British had been slowly building up their power. By 1647, they had 23 trading posts across India, and continued to gain more in the following decades. The three most important of these were Madras, founded in 1639, Bombay, founded in 1661, and Calcutta, founded in 1690. These are the cities of Chennai, Mumbai, and Kolkata today, respectively, and would serve as the most important cities in British-ruled India. The British had found great success in southern India, where the collapse of the Vijayanagara Empire in the early 17th century created plenty of minor rulers and petty kingdoms, eager to get an edge over their rivals by allying with the British and getting the protection of the British troops and British ships. Despite what you might expect, the British did not immediately start conquering everything on the subcontinent. For most of the 17th and early 18th century, things were relatively quiet. The British were more concerned with fending off rival Dutch and French interests than in conquering native territory. The British enjoyed productive relations with the Mughals and local princes. The British were few in number. They lacked both the inclination or the power to start making enemies of India's people. This focus on trade was lucrative and successful for Britain, with some 1/7 of its imports being from India by the early 18th century. That's not to say the British weren't involved in Indian wars or politics, but they were far from a dominant force. Instead, the British and other European powers were treated as potential allies, sources of wealth, and providers of arms for Indians to resolve their own conflicts. Rather than Europeans suddenly showing up and taking charge of Indian history, Europeans were more of a wild card stepping into existing rivalries, alliances, and conflicts. The Europeans, of course, brought their own conflicts, not least of all the British and the French. The French East India Company had established itself at Pondicherry, and by the 18th century was Britain's main European rival in India. They fought three wars known as the Carnatic Wars that began as extensions of European wars, but became more interwoven with Indian conflicts over time. The First Carnatic War of 1746 to 1749 was mostly an expansion of the ongoing Austrian War of Succession to India. A second war erupted between 1749 and 1754 when the British and French backed separate candidates to become the Nawab of the Carnatic, a conflict that the British ultimately won. The third and final Carnatic War effectively spelled the end of French power in India. Again, war in Europe. This time the 7 Years' War spilled over into India. The French were more aggressive, but no more successful, facing a string of defeats in Chandanagar in 1757 and Wandiwash in 1760, before the British captured the center of French power in India at Pondicherry in 1761. The French and British signed a treaty that returned Pondicherry to the French in 1763, but the British would exercise significant control over them, and the French were forced to support British-backed client governments in India. The British had fended off all of the rival European powers in India, but almost simultaneously a new phase began, where Britain would extend its dominance over Indian power too. As part of its conflict with the French, the British had fortified their outpost at Fort William in Calcutta. This military buildup put the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah, on edge, and he demanded the British stop. When they refused, Siraj gathered his army and marched on Calcutta. The meager British garrison was no match for Siraj's army, and the British commander was forced to flee, leaving a token force of British and Indian allied soldiers to hold back the Nawab long enough to escape. The Indian soldiers immediately went over to Siraj while the British troops were captured. After taking the fort, the approximately 60 captured British soldiers were shoved into a tiny 14 by 18-foot hole in the fort's prison, which became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Stuffed into the hole with no food, water, or fresh air, around 2/3 of the men died in agony overnight. It was probably done by soldiers without Siraj's knowledge. But when news about the Black Hole incident reached the British, they were furious. An East India Company army was dispatched from the company base in Madras and met Siraj's forces at the Battle of Plassey. Unbeknownst to Siraj, the British had made a secret deal with one of his generals, Mir Jafar, to betray the Nawab in the battle. When Siraj's 50,000 men met the British army of 3,000, it was crushed. Mir Jafar quietly withdrew his troops at a critical point in the battle, allowing the British to cut down the Bengal army at a rate of almost 20 Bengali losses to 1 British. The Battle of Plassey was a landmark moment. Siraj was captured and executed, with Mir Jafar being named the new Nawab of Bengal. But in effect, the British now ruled there. It is widely considered the start of British colonial rule in India. Mir Jafar was no more loyal to the British than he was to Siraj. He quickly allied with the Dutch to throw off the British, who then chose to back his son-in-law, Mir Qasim, instead. Qasim proved unreliable, and the British decided to forgive Jafar and return him to power. Qasim was less than happy and appealed to the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II for aid. The Mughal Emperor heeded the call, as did the Nawab of Awadh, combining the most powerful leaders of the Mughal Empire and its subject territories against the British at the Battle of Buxar in 1764. Despite outnumbering the British by more than 2-1, the Mughal forces were soundly defeated. In the resulting Treaty of Allahabad, the defeated Mughal emperor granted the EIC the right to collect all taxes and revenues from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Known as the Diwani, this privilege was technically being done on the behalf of the Mughal emperor, and the company owed him an annual tribute from that revenue, but it was still a humiliating concession for the Mughals. Having defeated the French, the Bengalis, and the Mughals by 1765, the British had established control over a sizable portion of India and made themselves the greatest military power on the subcontinent. Most of India was still ruled by Indians, but it would not be for long. The age of company rule had begun. It's been said that the British acquired their empire by accident. That's a misleading way to present it, but it's certainly the case that the British Empire was not pre-planned in advance. When the EIC arrived in India, it didn't do so with dreams of conquest of the subcontinent. After acquiring the Diwani, the company initially didn't show much interest in governing or reforming anything. Their primary concern was trade, and so long as trade continued, they didn't feel the need to sweep out the native officials or pass laws to reshape Indian society. This would change over time, but the company's stated policy was to, quote, adapt our regulations to the manners and understandings of the people, adhering closely as we are able to their ancestral uses and institutions. In short, do as little as possible to keep profit high. This was seen in their response to a famine that gripped Bengal in 1769 and 1770. Monsoon failures in 1768 and drought in 1769 combined to provoke sweeping crop failures. But despite being warned of a potential famine on the horizon, the company did not take concrete steps to prepare, and company officials were more concerned with the interruptions to trade. By the time famine struck in earnest in November of 1769, they were still unprepared. They set up grain distribution centers in early 1770, but these were not enough to contain the crisis, which worsened over the summer and only stopped with the monsoon rains in the second half of 1770. At the time, officials estimated some 10 million dead, but modern scholarship says a more realistic number is around 1 million. Into the 1770s, the British were still largely ignorant of India, and few of its officials spoke an Indian language. In 1773, Parliament tried to clear things up with the Regulating Act, which reined in the company's power and tried to impose some sort of organization to British rule there. The company had to ensure a set amount of goods returned to Britain annually, and had to pay for the privilege of holding Indian territories on behalf of the Crown. It also established a governing council of 5 members to help manage India and a governor-general to be appointed to oversee all affairs in India. The British continued to make various tweaks to administration in the coming decades. Most significantly, in 1793, the Cornwallis Code, implemented by Governor-General Charles Cornwallis, famous as the British commander who surrendered at Yorktown during the American Revolution, which claimed to tackle corruption in company ranks. It banned those holding offices from engaging in private trade, purged corrupt officials, and tightened up a tax system based heavily on the existing Mughal one. But it also banned Indians from holding higher offices in the company hierarchy. To the British, Indians were inherently immoral and untrustworthy, so banning them from power was a form of fighting corruption. Cornwallis's code symbolized a racist attitude that would define British rule in the subcontinent. Indians could still serve the British as soldiers, though, and there were over 100,000 of them, known as sepoys, by 1800, which the company would find plenty of use for. Aside from the British in Bengal, and with the Mughals all but irrelevant, the greatest Indian power was the Marathas, who ruled most of western and northern India. Further south, the Kingdom of Mysore controlled the southwestern coast. The Nizams of Hyderabad clung to power in the central and southern Deccan, and the Sikhs had asserted themselves in the Punjab. While Britain continued to insist that its only interest was in trade, in a matter of decades they would defeat or absorb all of these remaining powers, and embroiled themselves in a complicated web of shifting rivalries and alliances. First on the chopping block was Mysore. Mysore had arisen in the wake of the Maratha defeat at Paniput, using the Marathas' weaknesses to carve out a kingdom of their own in the south. When Mysore refused to cooperate with British trade ambitions, the British joined the Marathas in Hyderabad in waging a war on them in 1767. But Mysore shocked the British by defeating their armies and marching up to the gates of Madras. Mysore's ruler, Hyder Ali, compelled the British to make peace and sign a protective treaty against the Marathas. The British did not honor that treaty, though, leaving Mysore to fend for itself against Maratha attacks, which encouraged Hyder Ali to launch a second war in 1780. Initially, it was very successful, and Mysore defeated the British handily at the Battle of Palilur using modified artillery that used rocket-like projectiles. The tide of the war turned, though, with British victories and Hyder's death. And in 1784, his son, Tipu Sultan, signed a peace treaty with the British to stop the fighting. There was a third war between 1790 and 1792. But this time the British called in support from the Marathas and Hyderabad, who had both become uncomfortable with Mysore's military power. Tipu put up a strong defense, but even the so-called Tiger of Mysore could not win against those odds, and he was forced to surrender about half of his territory. The British returned for a fourth time in 1799 to finish the job. Tipu had secretly reached out to Napoleon, who was conquering Egypt at this time, which the British took as a sign that Mysore was too much trouble to tolerate. In February 1799, company forces invaded Mysore, captured the capital at Seringapatam, killed Tipu Sultan in combat, and added his territory to their domains. At the same time, the British compelled Hyderabad to sign itself over as a protectorate, giving Britain control of nearly all of southern India. The Marathas would not be long for the world either. The British had stepped into Maratha affairs back in 1775 by backing a rival claimant to Maratha rule, only for their faction to be defeated. However, that claimant's son, Baji Rao II, was eventually installed as a puppet ruler by the same nobles who'd opposed the British. After reaching adulthood, Baji Rao reached out to the British and signed the Treaty of Bassein in 1802, securing British support for his rule in exchange for allowing British troops and a British advisor into his territories. The treaty was described as the death knell of the Maratha Empire, and most of the Maratha nobility recognized it as such. 3 of the 4 leading Maratha class, the Bhonsle, Okar, and Scindias, took up arms against the British and Baji Rao, but they were defeated in the Second Anglo-Maratha War. In the resulting treaty, Baji Rao II became effectively a British puppet, ruling the Marathas while the British acquired control of new territory, like the state of Haryana and the major city of Ahmednagar. The British also forced a close alliance with the 4th Maratha clan, the Gaikwads, who had not opposed them in the previous war. In 1817, a dispute over tax collection led to Baji Rao murdering a Gaikwad diplomat. The British brokered a treaty that crammed down harsh terms on Baji Rao, who by this point the British felt was becoming a bit too powerful and independent. The terms demanded that Baji Rao hand over key forts, stop collecting taxes from the Gaikwad lands, abolish his cavalry, and break off diplomatic ties with other Indian states. They were unreasonable demands crafted to back Baji Rao into a corner. Baji Rao refused to abide by the insulting terms and began rallying his forces to oppose the British. However, British spies were fully aware of him building his forces and conspiring to assassinate British officials. In November of that year, the British sent an army to deal with Pindari raiders in Maratha territory. Baji Rao, with the support of the Bhonsle and Okar clans, attacked this army, but was soundly defeated at the Battle of Kadki. The Marathas went into retreat, and the initiative stayed with the British. Over the next 6 months, the British systematically dismantled the Marathas. Baji Rao was exiled, and all of his lands were taken under British dominion. With the fall of the Marathas in 1818, Britain now controlled almost all of India. The British spent the first half of the 19th century absorbing the remaining areas of India and its surrounding territory. They took Surat in 1800, the Carnatic, Nellore, and Trichinopoly in 1802, and Nepal in 1816. In 1824, the British waged a war against Burma, acquiring large areas of northeastern India, most notably Assam, and taking more territory in Burma in subsequent wars. In 1838, the British were fighting on the opposite side of India by waging the First Anglo-Afghan War, which resulted in the destruction of Kabul and the extension of British influence but not direct control of Afghanistan. In 1843, it was Sindh's turn to be attacked by the British, and in a lightning 5-week campaign, just 3,000 British troops under Charles Napier defeated the ruling Talpurs and brought Sindh under non-Muslim control for the first time in 1,000 years. Often, the British didn't need to invade a territory to acquire it. Many of the remaining Indian rulers, controlling small areas with no hope of opposing the British, submitted en masse, accepting British authority and limits on their power in exchange for British protection, trade, and permission to stay on their throne. These princely states numbered around 500 and comprised about 1/3 of British-controlled India, ranging between kingdoms of several hundred square miles and holdings that were barely more than a town. In 1848, they cut out the middleman by implementing the doctrine of lapse, by which the British reserved the right to annex any Indian state that had no adult male heir upon the death of a ruling monarch. The British used this system to acquire Satara in 1848, Jodhpur and Sambalpur in 1849, Baghat in 1850, Udaipur in 1852, Jhansi and Nagpur in 1854, and Tanjore and Arcot in 1855. The British also annexed Awadh in 1856, citing internal corruption and failures of its government as justification. By the 1840s, the last truly independent power left in India was that of the Sikhs. As Mughal power had declined back in the 18th century, the Sikhs had formed republics throughout the Punjab called Mizils. Beginning in 1799, the leader of one of these Mizils, named Ranjit Singh, began unifying them by capturing cities like Lahore and Amritsar to create a new Sikh Empire. Despite its name, the Sikh Empire had Muslims, Hindus, Parsis, and others within its border, and they were treated well initially. People of many faiths could be found as officers, administrators, and advisors. Hindus especially were treated with respect. The Sikhs passed a total ban on the slaughter of cows, and Sikh rulers patronized Hindu temples, although this cow slaughter ban was not so popular with Muslims. This Sikh Empire acted as a bulwark against the invasions by the Afghan Durrani Empire, and quickly established itself as one of the major powers on the Indian subcontinent. They enjoyed good relations with the British at first, and the British were generally warmer towards the Sikhs than they were to Hindus. The empire's fortunes took a bad turn with Ranjit Singh's death in 1839. Over the next 4 years, the empire saw 4 different emperors, 3 of whom were assassinated, and a massive buildup of military forces as regional nobles and insecure leaders sought to protect themselves. In response to the chaos, the British increased their military presence along the border, which in turn angered the Sikhs. In December 1845, a Sikh army crossed the river Sutlej into disputed territory, which the British interpreted as an act of war. The resulting Anglo-Sikh War lasted less than 3 months, and the British dominated the battlefield. The seminal battle came as Sobraon of February 10, 1846, with British and Indian sepoys defeating the Sikh army. Towards the end of the battle, the Sikhs tried to withdraw across the Sutlej River, but the bridge broke, trapping them with the British. According to most accounts, the trapped Sikhs refused to surrender and fought to the last man. The battle brought an end to the war, and the resulting Treaty of Lahore ceded control of large swaths of territory to the British, or their subject rulers, most notably Kashmir, which got added to the lands of the Prince of Jammu. The 5-year-old heir, Duleep Singh, was installed in the Sikh Empire with a British regent, effectively giving control of the empire to the company. This arrangement caused resentment and led to a Sikh rebellion in 1848. Which dragged on for almost a year until the British won a decisive victory at the Battle of Gujrat. In the wake of the Second Anglo-Sikh War, Duleep Singh was deposed and exiled to Britain, while the territories of the Sikh Empire were fully absorbed by the British. With the end of the Sikh Empire, Britain now controlled virtually every inch of India. The British wanted to civilize India, to stamp out the traditions and practices that Britain disliked and impose their own ideas upon it. Some of these were more popular than others. Most famously, the Sati Regulation of 1829 made the ancient practice of widow burning illegal and punished anyone who tried to compel a widow to do it. Also significant was the 1843 Indian Slave Trade Act, which made slavery and slave trading illegal in India, bringing it into line with the rest of the British Empire, where the trade had been banned since 1833. Many Indians supported these laws, but objected to the British being the ones to impose them, rather than allowing Indians to change society with their own voices. Defenders of British imperialism have argued that India benefited from what the British did, citing laws like those banning sati and slavery as proof of the benefits of Britain's civilizing mission. The introduction of new technology, such as steam-powered ships, the telegraph, and of course the railroad, have also been championed as improvement. However, when it came to technology, the average Indian rarely benefited from them. They would never get to use a telegram, and the railroads were primarily for the transport of goods and resources, not the people who produced them. The British were also adamant that civilization meant British, not Indian. To achieve economic and political power, Indians had to undergo English education, adopt English habits, and speak the English language. In effect, the only path for an Indian to improve their position in British-ruled India was to become less Indian. The result was a sense of alienation and a simmering hostility towards the British. Indians were being ruled over by people who didn't much care about them. who had subjugated or destroyed anyone who opposed them, who promised improvements that most failed to see, who were trying to rewrite their society to match foreign ideas, and who had no interest in listening to what Indians had to say about it. It is inevitable that these embers of rebellion would spark an inferno, and when that inferno came, it would burn down empires. That inferno erupted over an unlikely source. By 1857, the company employed some 300,000 Indian soldiers known as sepoys, drawing from Muslims and Hindus alike. In the end, it was the ammunition these soldiers were given that triggered a massive rebellion. Rumors began to spread amongst the soldiers that the ammunition cartridges used in the standard-issue British rifles, which soldiers had to bite into to use, were being greased with tallow from cows and pigs. Hinduism and Islam had strict religious prohibitions on consuming each animal respectively. As the rumor spread, many sepoys came to believe that the British had done it intentionally to humiliate and defile their beliefs, while others thought it was unintentional but displayed a lack of care and respect from the British. In truth, there was no such animal grease in the cartridges. But once the rumor started, it was impossible to contain. The British suspended all production of the specific type of cartridge to try and calm people down. But most took it as confirmation that the rumors had been true. On May 10, 1857, their anger reached a boiling point, and thousands of sepoys based in Meerut near Delhi rose up and massacred every European they could find. Soon, civilians joined them, and then the nobility. The sepoys marched to Delhi fort, and the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II threw his support behind the rebels. Fighting broke out across India. In Kanpur, for example, the sepoys revolted against the British population. They offered the 900 British residents of the city the chance to leave and escorted them to the boats, only to massacre them. Just 7 people survived. Support for the rebellion was far from universal. As in most rebellions, the vast majority kept their heads down and waited for violence to fizzle out. Sikhs and Pashtuns generally threw in with the British, and their loyalty earned them favor over their Hindu and Muslim counterparts afterwards. The British were utterly shocked by the rebellion. They had dismissed the Indians as passive and compliant and were now paying the price. They scrambled to call in reinforcements from as far afield as China and Crimea, and in September they marched upon Delhi. Ultimately, the rebels were defeated and the British inflicted a bloody revenge upon Delhi's population, complete with looting and pillaging of the city's treasures. Among the victims were the Mughal princes, who were publicly executed for supporting the rebels. The Mughal emperor himself was deposed and exiled to Burma, and the Mughal Empire was formally dissolved after some 300 years of existence. The rebellion was fully suppressed by 1858, but some 800,000 Indians and British had died from a combination of combat, massacres, disease, or famine as a result of it. Thousands of rebels were executed, with the method of tying them to the front of a cannon and firing being a particular favorite that the British borrowed from the Mughals. The rebellion failed to overthrow British rule, but it did rack up another important casualty: the East India Company. The company had been falling out of favor in London for a while, and the rebellion was the final nail in the coffin that proved the company was no longer fit to rule India. The company's charter was not extended, and in 1858, the British government took direct control over all of its territory in India, beginning the age of the British Raj. Still, the rebellion had shown that Indians could unite to force change, and once that realization had been made, it could not be forgotten. The formal annexation of India did not immediately change much. The Governor-General was renamed the Viceroy, and the Executive Council was expanded with more members and could now include more Indians. But for the average Indian, these changes meant little. They still had no voice in affairs, but there was more pressure than ever for them to find one. Trade continued to be a high priority for the British during the Raj as it had during company rule. Agriculture formed the backbone of this trade. Opium counted for as much as 30% of Indian exports in the 1860s, but restrictions on the trade all but eliminated it in the following decades. Cotton and jute for textile production were another major Indian export, especially in Bengal, where some 20,000 people were employed in jute mills. Then, of course, there was tea, the production and export of which grew massively in the late 19th century to eclipse that of China. By 1900, almost 70,000 tons of tea was being exported to Britain from India every year. These exports were primarily under the control of British merchants and traders, and it was they who reaped the profits. The life of an average Indian agricultural worker was not much different in 1860 as it had been in 1560. Even the celebrated railroads, which Britain spent tens of millions of pounds building across India after 1857, primarily served to move goods, not people, and certainly not the common people. Through it all, the British remained a tiny minority in India. At any one point, there were no more than about 100,000 British people in India. Soldiers, missionaries, sailors, government officials, and their families made up the majority. Few came to settle permanently there or integrate into native society. The British in India took great pains to isolate themselves from the population, preferring to live in walled-off districts with tea gardens, churches, and other amenities expected by the British upper crust. Interactions between Indians and the British were strictly controlled and reflected dominant racial and gender attitudes. For example, relationships between Indian men and British women were strictly prohibited. Meanwhile, liaisons between British men and Indian women, in most cases between soldiers and prostitutes, but also aristocratic men who left their wives at home, were begrudgingly accepted but officially discouraged. By some estimates, over 60% of British soldiers serving in India contracted venereal diseases. But responsibility for this was laid squarely on Indian women, who British authorities viewed as innately unclean and corrupting. The Contagious Diseases Act of 1868, for example, had a long list of provisions and punishments for Indian women blamed for spreading such diseases, but not for the British men. The British figures who had some of the most direct interactions with Indians were Christian missionaries. European missionaries had followed close on the heels of traders in the 16th century, but a cultural shift in Britain in the 19th century lent huge support to missionary work across the empire, and India was flooded with them as a result. These missionaries could be a blessing and a curse. Missionaries brought education, setting up thousands of schools that taught rural children how to read and write. On the other hand, these schools were designed to break them off from Hindu religion and Indian social attitudes to remake them into good Christians. These missionaries had negative views of Indian religion, seeing it as misguided superstition at best and outright demonic at worst, and often held similarly dim views of Indians as a race. Missionaries often treated Indians as people who were little better than children, needing the guidance of Europeans to keep them from idleness and stagnation. Broadly speaking, British missionaries did not see the success in India that Europeans had seen converting people in the Americas or Africa. However, there were a sizable number of Indians who did convert. Take the Khasi people of Assam, who were the recipients of a Welsh-led mission from 1841. The lead missionary, Thomas Jones, established a writing system for the Khasi language and translated much of the Bible into that language. Tens of thousands of Khasi children were taught to read and write with it through missionary schools. And today, over 80% of the 1.5 million Khasi are still Christian. Today, there are around 30 million Christians in India, almost all of whom come from communities converted by British missionaries. That's barely 2% of the population, but they outnumber Buddhists, Jains, and Sikhs overall. Outside of missionary schools, Indian elites could acquire a Western-style education, but it didn't take long for these Indians to begin wielding these ideas against the British. For example, in 1878, Indian critics turned Britain's rhetoric of free speech and free press back on itself when the British passed the Vernacular Press Act, which censored criticism of British policies in the Second Anglo-Afghan War. While there was nothing like the 1857 rebellion, local resistance against British policy became more common in the late 19th century. There were several rebellions among the Adivasi against British control of their ever-shrinking rural communities, most notably the one led by Birsa Munda in 1899 to 1900. British attempts to push social reforms were also a point of contention. For example, the British pushed for expanded education for women, raising the marriage for girls, and the rights of widows to remarry, all of which led to some opposition. For example, the 1891 Age of Consent Act, which raised the age of consent from 10 to 12, provoked massive riots and opposition in Bengal. Many of these reforms were supported by Indian intellectuals and many common people, but were often opposed on the principle that it wasn't Britain's place to rewrite Indian society, and that Indians should be the ones making those decisions. Other problems struck India that fueled disillusionment with British rule. Regional famines gripped Western and Central India in the late 1860s, and then Bengal in the 1870s. Millions died in food shortages in the 1890s across India, which were attributed to failures of the monsoon rains and overpopulation. British authorities were unable to respond effectively to them. Worse was the bubonic plague that re-emerged across South and East Asia in the late 19th century. Some 12 million Indians were killed by the plague, and the quarantines the British imposed to contain it earned no less resentment from Indians than the piles of the dead. Clearly, Indians wanted to speak out against British policy, and in 1885, a group of Indian intellectuals created a forum to do just that, with the foundation of the Indian National Congress. The INC, or simply Congress, became a forum and a focal point for Indian rights advocates, and later the independence movement. It was envisioned as a way for Indians from every province and of every faith to voice their views directly to the British in a way that couldn't be ignored. It embraced democracy, offering provinces elected representatives to stand for Congress and ensure their voices were heard. Even Congress's founders were surprised by its success. From its 73 founding delegates in 1885, in just 4 years it grew to 2,000 delegates. It was a formidable showing of Indian autonomy, and it quickly began pressuring the British to listen. In 1892, the British made several concessions to Congress's demands, such as expanding access to the coveted civil service examinations and opening some positions in local councils to popular elections. They were small steps, but they were a start, and Congress's founding proved to be a landmark moment in the path to independence. By the late 19th century, an Indian consciousness was clearly growing. However, there were many issues and divisions to be worked out among Indians, and none proved more troublesome than the relationship between Hindus and Muslims. Tensions between Hindus and Muslims were nothing new. Even aside from the wars and conquest, there had been episodes of violence between Hindu locals and Muslim traders since Muslims first arrived in Indian ports. The intolerant policies of the later Mughal Empire also alienated Hindus and embittered the Hindu nobles who took power as the empire declined. The British also complicated matters. Britain dealt with the divide between Hindus and Muslims by establishing separate systems of justice and applying different laws to the different groups. It was hoped that this would minimize conflict, which it did in some ways, but in others, it created a legal barrier between Hindus and Muslims that only encouraged their division. The British were also generally more sympathetic to the Muslims than the Hindus, and as a result, Muslims were given preferential treatment as soldiers and in the fiercely contested civil service positions open to Indians. The result was that by the late 19th century, Hindu-Muslim violence was becoming common. For example, the Mapila Muslim community in southwest India launched no fewer than 6 revolts between 1839 and 1921 over oppressive and discriminatory treatment by Hindu landlords. Many of the disputes were religious in nature. For example, one riot in Bombay in 1851 erupted when a Parsi journal published an image of the Prophet Muhammad, resulting in attacks on Parsis by Muslims in the city. The treatment of cows was a particularly thorny issue from the 1870s, with Hindus taking issue with Muslims killing and eating them. The so-called cow protection movement emerged to demand an end to the killing and eating of cows, while Muslims took this as an imposition of Hindu religion upon their lives and an attack on Islam. This resulted in deadly violence in the last decades of the 19th century. In 1893 alone, some 100 people were killed in violence over cow killing in the Punjab, and several hundred more died in rioting in Bombay over the same issue. Nevertheless, Muslims helped to found Congress and shared the desire for a greater voice in governing India. But it was apparent that Hindu and Muslim interests were in conflict. Almost immediately after its founding, Muslims began abandoning Congress, and within 8 years of its existence, it lost half of its original Muslim membership. With the dawn of the 20th century, there was clearly an appetite for change in India. But it appeared that this appetite was concentrated in an educated elite and not the disinterested masses. Something needed to happen to motivate the common people to mobilize, and that thing would be the Bengal Partition Plan. In 1905, Britain proposed a plan to partition Bengal and its almost 80 million people, merging Muslim East Bengal with Assam and the Hindu West with Bihar and Orissa. The British believed it would make governance easier and consolidate religious groups in the same places. Most Muslims welcomed the plan, but the Hindu reaction was one of indignation. Congress and other Indian leaders saw it as an attack on Hindu autonomy and an attempt at divide and rule across the continent. The strength of the reaction would catch everyone by surprise. Taking advantage of a growing press and an increasingly literate public, the opposition movement to the partition spread like wildfire. Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandra Pal, affectionately known as Lal, Bal, and Paul, became the figureheads of a protest movement that spread across all over India. With Congress's support, the movement implemented a policy of economic non-cooperation known as Swadeshi. They told Indians to stop buying British goods or foreign imports and instead buy Indian. Indian shops refused to stock imported goods, and mobs gathered up foreign goods to burn in bonfires. The results were felt in the economy. By 1908, there had been a 25% decrease in imports. The Indians understood how important trade and wealth were to the British, and economic resistance was the best way to strike at them. Violence was rare, but when it happened, it was used by the British to condemn the whole movement. Lal was deported to Mandalay in Burma in 1907, while Bal was arrested and put on trial in connection with an attempted bomb attack on British officials, an attack which he certainly had no knowledge of beforehand, and was also deported to Burma. Resistance continued in some form until 1912, when the British were forced to withdraw the plan. They proposed a new partition based on language, which did little to please anyone, but it was less despised than the original plan. Still, in 1912, this unhappiness was expressed in a bomb attack on the incoming Viceroy Charles Hardinge that killed one of his attendants. The Bengal Partition was a tide shift in Indian history. For the first time, a mass movement had animated most of the population against British power. The masses were not yet clamoring for independence, but they had proven willing to band together for change, and they'd proven it could work. However, the sharp divisions between Hindus and Muslims expressed an irreconcilable rift between the two on the future of India. In 1913, the All India Muslim League was founded as a Muslim alternative to Congress, which would, in time, pave the way for India's partition. The First World War blindsided the world, and India suffered its own issues as a result. Indians generally supported Britain during the war, and some 1.5 million Indians served in the military over the course of the conflict. Simple loyalty, steady pay, and the opportunity for social advancement all helped explain why men joined up to fight a war that was far away from their home. Indian troops served in virtually every theater of the war, including France, Gallipoli, and Egypt, but made their biggest mark in Mesopotamia, where they comprised the majority of British-aligned forces. Many Indians distinguished themselves on the battlefield. For example, Khudad Khan became the first Indian, although technically today he would be counted as Pakistani, to receive the Victoria Cross for his valiant defense of a machine gun position against a German assault in Belgium in October 1914. The war has complicated effects within India. Wartime rises in taxes and prices caused economic hardship, compounded by poor weather which produced food shortages in some areas. Other industries prospered, namely steel and iron, who benefited from higher demand to supply the war effort. The sacrifices needed for the war led Indians to question what it was all for. Many Indians began to question the British claims of fighting for freedom and civilization when they did not practice that freedom in India. In 1916, this feeling of dissatisfaction led the Congress and the Muslim League together to sign the Lucknow Agreement, issuing a joint demand for expanded democratic rights, minority protections, and judicial independence for India. This was followed by the foundation of the Indian Home Rule League, spearheaded by British-Irish activist Annie Besant, which pushed for Indian autonomy. Over 60,000 Indians died in the fighting, but even worse was the Spanish flu outbreak immediately after, which killed around 14 million Indians, or about 5% of the population. After the war, the appetite for reform was stronger than ever, but India was left disappointed with its options. The Montfort reforms of 1919 granted some democratic concessions and expanded Indian control of certain government departments, like education and health, but the British kept a firm grip on justice and policing. But it was the Rowlatt Act, which extended wartime powers of trying political cases without a jury, that provoked the strongest opposition seen so far. Indian leaders recognized that this law could be used to crack down on independence protesters, and they responded strongly. Protests and strikes erupted across the nation, which the British responded to with force. Nowhere was this more infamous than in Amritsar. Tensions were high in the city after the national protests, and a heavily publicized attack on European women in early April. In defiance of British orders, on April 13th, thousands of people gathered in the Jallianwala Bagh Garden to celebrate the religious festival of Baisakhi. The British military commander in the city, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, was outraged, and he'd make sure the Indians were punished. At 5:30 that evening, Dyer and 50 of his soldiers marched into the Garden Plaza. Enclosed on three sides by walls and buildings, his troops blocked the only exit. Then, without a single warning to disperse, Dyer ordered his men to open fire. For the next 10 minutes, the soldiers unloaded every last round of ammunition into the terrified crowd. Many Indians fell to the bullets, while others were crushed to death. It was a ruthless, intentional massacre, and when the smoke cleared, at least 379 people were dead. Some estimates put the death toll as high as 1,500. News of the massacre spread like wildfire. People across India were horrified. Many of those who had supported the British now turned against them. In their attempts to suppress protests, the British encouraged countless people to stand with Congress in demanding an end to British rule. Even in Britain, the massacre was fiercely condemned. Secretary of State for War Winston Churchill called it monstrous, and the House of Commons voted 247 to 37 to condemn Dyer, but he did not face any serious consequences. Dyer himself was unapologetic, believing until the day he died that he did the right thing. He was not alone in that belief, and he received more in donations from supporters of his actions than the families of the victims ever did in compensation from the British government. The Amritsar Massacre was a turning point for Indian independence. Momentum moved decisively in favor of independence, and as the British imprisoned more and more protesters, 30,000 by the end of 1921 alone, calls for independence grew, and many Indians clamored for a leader to direct their struggle. Fortunately, they had one. Mahatma Gandhi was born to a Gujarati merchant family in 1869. At age 18, he traveled to London where he studied law before moving to South Africa in 1893. South Africa was home to a large Indian population, and Gandhi spent the next 22 years of his life there. Gandhi's experiences in South Africa permanently shaped him. He became a devout Hindu, and he saw firsthand the sharp differences in treatment between racial groups there. Gandhi also served in a medical capacity in the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902, which exposed him to the horrors of violence and war. Gandhi became a community leader and an activist, leading nonviolent campaigns by the 1910s, and was arrested in 1913 for leading a great march across South Africa in protest against British colonial policy. Gandhi swore by a nonviolent resistance tactic he called Satyagraha, which absolutely prohibited violence and called for non-cooperation with discriminatory and oppressive policies. In this way, Gandhi hoped to maintain the moral high ground over the British, while also treating them with respect and gentleness. He returned to India in 1915, already famous as an activist, and amassed a rapid following for his advocacy against British imperialism and support for the Home Rule movement. In the wake of the Amritsar Massacre, he was swept into leadership of the INC and pushed it in a more firmly pro-independence direction. Naturally, this angered the British, who arrested him and dozens of other INC leaders in 1922 and sentenced him to 6 years in prison. Following his release from prison, Gandhi found the independence movement bitterly split over its goals and methods. Disheartened and unable to unite them, Gandhi pivoted to anti-poverty work and left the political arena for several years. In his absence, the independence movement continued to take shape. Albeit one Gandhi was not fully happy with, the British were forced to hand over more concessions, unable to stem the rising tide for independence. In 1921, India got a bicameral elected parliament and greater financial control over Indian affairs through a tariff board. The British finally agreed to Indian demands to have civil service exams in India, ending the requirement for Indians to take lengthy and expensive trips to England in hopes of advancing their careers. Another formative moment arrived in 1928, when the British set up the Simon Commission to review governance in India. The Indians were rightly insulted that the commission didn't include any Indians, and both Congress and the Muslim League protested it. Congress set up its own commission and reached its own conclusions, demanding a self-governing India with Commonwealth status. Hot on the heels of this demand, in 1929, Congress elected a new leader, a rising star of the nationalist movement named Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru's father, Motilal, was also a leading Congress figure, but his declining health in his old age cleared the way for his son to take over the family dynasty. With Nehru's election, Congress's demands changed. On December 19, 1929, Congress issued a call for nothing short of full independence for India. The Muslim League was not yet ready for such a demand. They were still hoping for a self-governing Muslim constituency within the British Empire. But soon enough, they would become bold enough to call for a fully independent state too. In 1933, during a meeting with British officials in London, a pamphlet was circulated among League members calling for the establishment of a fully independent Muslim nation in India, uniting the Punjab, Afghan, Kashmir, Sindh, and Balochistan into what they call Pakistan. The British continued to drag their feet, but with the vision of independence clarifying across India, they were now acting mostly in denial. More reforms came in 1935, establishing representative provincial governments with separate Hindu and Muslim electorates. But Congress's landslide victory came with the resounding cry that this was simply not enough. Only independence would satisfy India. In 1929, the Depression hit India hard. and had an indirect effect on the fight for independence. India has been a major exporter of food and other resources, but the depression caused a collapse of the export economy as the global market shrank. Foreign investment dried up, grain production plummeted, and many families were hit with poverty and an inability to pay their taxes. Agriculture struggled and India found itself in the unprecedented position of having to import a large amount of its food. On the other hand, the lack of foreign investment allowed Indian investors to invest in the industries that weathered the depression, such as textiles. Many of these Indian investors were also supporters of Congress, who funneled their newfound wealth into opposition to the British. Amidst this difficulty, the British passed a salt tax that required Indians to pay the British exorbitant fees for use of the basic resources. This included even the act of boiling seawater to extract the salt. These taxes naturally fell hardest on the poor and was enough to bring Gandhi fully back into the independence fight. With the support of Nehru and Congress, Gandhi led a national protest against the move. For 24 days, Gandhi and his supporters undertook a peaceful 240-mile walk from Sabarmati to Dandi on the Gujarat coast in protest at the absurd laws. Global media attention was captured by the march. Upon reaching his destination on April 5th, Gandhi scooped up a pile of mud and salt and said, "With this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire." The simple act was powerful and easy to emulate. Millions across India followed his lead, and it became one of the most iconic moments of the independence struggle. The British responded forcefully, arresting some 60,000 people in association with the Salt March and the wider non-cooperation movement it encouraged. Although Gandhi once again pivoted towards poverty and social inequality after 1934, the independence movement continued strong without him, simmering away for the rest of the 1930s, proving that it would stand strong no matter how much the British wanted to defy it. Unfortunately, the Second World War arrived to throw a wrench in global affairs. India was informed of its involvement in the war on September 1, 1939. It was a decision made by the British government, not Indians themselves. But the Indian people broadly agreed with the Allied cause, especially against the Japanese, whose assault through East and Southeast Asia would be infamously brutal. Indian soldiers once again served a vital role in the Allied war effort, with some 1.4 million Indians serving on the battlefields from North Africa to Burma. Naturally, most Indian troops were tasked with the war in Southeast Asia. Indian troops formed the backbone of the desperate British defenses of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Burma, among others. And as a result, many fell into the hands of the Japanese. Domestically, the war caused great tension between the British and Congress. Congress supported the war, but in exchange they wanted concessions that the British were unwilling to give. In October 1939, the British High Command executed wartime powers to force provincial Congress representatives to resign. An attempt by the renowned diplomat Sir Stafford Cripps, who was a good friend of Nehru's, to negotiate a position for Congress leaders in a sort of wartime cabinet for India fell through, and Indians were left alienated from leadership throughout the war. Gandhi led the call for non-violent resistance to Britain's heavy-handed policy and led the Quit India movement in 1942. The British responded by arresting him, the entire Congress leadership, and some 90,000 supporters over the course of the war. This infuriated many, and some of the Quit India protests became more aggressive, with sabotage of public infrastructure and occasional riots. Gandhi was released in 1944 and continued the Quit India campaign for the rest of the war. There were those in India who sought a very different path and saw the war as a chance for independence from another angle. One of those was Subhas Chandra Bose, who stands as one of the most complicated figures in the story of Indian independence. Bose threw his support behind Hitler and the Axis, believing that India might achieve independence by having the British be defeated by the Axis. Bose traveled to Germany, where he met with Nazi leaders and spent several years building an alliance. Hitler even agreed to allow an Indian division into the SS, and this Tiger Legion would gain several thousand members. In 1943, as the war in Europe turned against Germany, Bose traveled to Indonesia and cozied up to the Japanese instead. Bose ended up recruiting some of the Indian prisoner of wars in Southeast Asia to serve in an anti-British Indian National Army. In March 1943, this army collaborated with the Japanese to invade India and the often forgotten Operation Yugo. The invasion lasted several months, but the Indian people did not rise to support them as Bose had hoped. Instead, Indian and British troops mounted a fierce defense of India, earning 2 hard-fought victories at the battles of Kohima and Imphal that proved to be Japan's most costly defeats thus far, and spelled an end to Japanese expansion in the Southeast Asian theater. But if war and political unrest weren't enough, India was struck with yet another crisis in the 1943 Bengal Famine. India had partially relied on food imports before the war, but Japanese control of Southeast Asia, especially Burma, put India on the brink of a food crisis. By 1943, food shortages were becoming a serious issue in many parts of India. Britain mostly took an interventionist approach to the famine, cracking down on hoarding and instituting rationing across most of India. Bengal was the exception to this. There, the government took a non-interventionist approach, hoping the problem would resolve itself. This strategy, or lack thereof, was a colossal failure. By the time the British Viceroy had deployed troops to Bengal to override the local government and distribute grain, 1 million people had starved to death. The response from the British governments has been fiercely criticized ever since. Critics have charged the British with neglecting to help India and intentionally or negligently allowing the famine to continue. Defenders of British actions counter that in fact some 1 million tons of food was shipped to India during the famine. Churchill had wanted to ship more and sought help from the Americans to do that, but they simply lacked the ships and manpower to do so. Japanese dominance in Southeast Asia made the prospect of shipping food to the region a dangerous prospect, more likely to result in sunken ships and dead sailors than famine relief. But the inability of the British to help India only proved the point that Indian independence advocates had made. If Britain was unable to meet the challenges of controlling India, then it had no business trying to do so. When the war ended in 1945, the world and India were a very different place. It was impossible now to deny the overwhelming demands for independence. Congress swept over 90% of the non-Muslim seats in the first post-war elections, and the Muslim League took a similar 90% share of the Muslim ones. Meanwhile, in Britain, the war had destroyed both Britain's ability and desire to hold an empire abroad. Almost immediately after the war, the British announced their intention to leave India, and in February 1947 set a provisional date of June 1947 for their withdrawal, later pushed back to August. The issue now was how to conduct that withdrawal. There were some, like Gandhi, who favored a unified India, with all of the territories of the British Raj handed over to Indian rule in one piece. In reality, there was no other option than partition between Hindu and Muslim. Calls from Sikhs to receive an independent nation in the Punjab were rejected. On June 2, 1947, representatives from Congress, the Muslim League, the Sikh community, and the British agreed on an outline plan to create 2 nations. Hindu-majority areas were easy to mark out, comprising most of the subcontinent, while the Muslim areas to be made into Pakistan were more awkward. Pakistan would have to be 2, West Pakistan comprising Sindh, and Punjab Kashmir, the northwest frontier province, and Baluchistan, with East Pakistan comprising the Muslim-majority areas of Bengal. The numerous princely states within India were allowed to pick their own fates, and virtually all of them agreed to hand over their territory to the new Republic of India. Still, the borders of this new India were still in flux as independence approached. In fact, the final borders of India and Pakistan were not agreed until the first week of August, barely a week before independence, and were not formally announced until the morning of Wednesday, August 14, 1947, the same day that Pakistan declared its independence. Rushed and problematic the partition would prove, but for many Indians, it was easy to put out of mind as the promise of independence was finally realized. Shortly before midnight on the night of August 14th, Jawaharlal Nehru ascended the steps of the Parliament House to address his nation and the world. As midnight ushered in August 15, 1947, India enjoyed independence for the first time in centuries. The legacy of its subjugation had left it many problems to fix, and it would find plenty of new problems to come, but it would face those problems standing on its own 2 feet, with a government drawn from its own people, striving to serve its own people, and hearkening to the voice of its own people. India now faced a monumental task: to establish a country that could successfully manage the numerous languages, faiths, and cultural identities within its borders, while navigating a world of bitter political divides and ideological hostility, where one wrong move could trigger a war that could wipe out nations in moments. The first issue facing India was the partition itself. The complexity of Indian geography and the imprecision of the border divisions meant that millions found themselves on the wrong side of the border. There were Hindus in Pakistan, Muslims in India, and religious minorities in both who were not happy with where they ended up. What followed was one of the largest mass migrations in history, with around 15 million people moving across India and Pakistan. The governments of India and Pakistan were not prepared, nor had they expected such a colossal migration. There was little government support for migrants, which left families and communities alone to organize the complex upheaval of their lives. Supplies of food and water weren't capable of handling the movement of people. Inevitably, hundreds of thousands died. Dehydration, starvation, exhaustion, exposure, and disease claimed countless victims. Tensions and violence between religious groups was both a cause and a product of this migration. Migrant convoys were attacked, sexual violence was rampant, and mob killings were widespread. To take a few examples, on September 22, 1947, some 3,000 Muslims were murdered in Amritsar by a mob of Sikhs. They opened fire on the train with rifles and then swept through the carriages with swords and knives to finish off the rest. On January 12, 1948, the tables were flipped in Gujarat, Pakistan, where around 1,500 Hindus and Sikhs were massacred when their train was attacked by a Muslim mob. Most of the migration and violence occurred in Bengal, the Punjab, Jammu, and Kashmir, which had long been the most religiously diverse areas of India. The scale of the migration in these places can be seen through statistics. In 1931, the Indian-controlled Punjab was 30% Muslim, but less than 2% in 1951. In Pakistani-controlled Punjab, 22% of people were Hindus or Sikhs in 1931, but just 0.16% were in 1951. Overall, it is estimated that over 1 million died as a result of the migrations or the violence that came with them. Kashmir proved a particularly difficult area to handle amidst the partition. Alongside the refugee crisis, the Maharaja of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, Hari Singh, had not settled on joining either India or Pakistan during the partition process. Singh's rule and that of his forefathers had fallen hard upon the Muslim Kashmiris. With the advent of partition, many Muslims in Kashmir jumped at the chance to overthrow him and join Pakistan. In June 1947, a major rebellion broke out in Poonch, spearheaded by Kashmiri veterans who had served in the war and who wanted to join with Pakistan. This rebellion escalated over the summer and into autumn until Pakistani troops intervened to support the rebels in October. Singh turned to India for help, offering to join India in exchange for military support. India agreed and immediately sent troops in to repel the Pakistanis. The initiative remained with Pakistan through to November though, with Pakistan successfully capturing Mirpur, where some estimates claim thousands of non-Muslims were killed by Pakistani forces. By early 1948, India gained the advantage and had launched Operation Victory to drive the Pakistanis back. The war was mostly fought as a series of small skirmishes rather than pitched battles, and the front line stabilized through 1948, where it remained largely static for the rest of the war. Eventually, the UN brokered a ceasefire that came into effect on January 1, 1949. A temporary border was drawn at the line of control, leaving about 2/3 of Kashmir in Indian hands and 1/3 in Pakistani hands. The plan was to hold a referendum to let the people of Kashmir decide their fate, but the two sides could never agree on proper terms, and such a referendum never came. The line of control is now effectively a permanent border between India and Pakistan, with only minor changes since 1949. The First Kashmir War, also called the First Indo-Pakistani War, was a sour beginning to the relations between the newly independent nations. Perhaps such conflict was inevitable, given the deep divides that emerged before independence. It was far from the last war between the two, not even the last over Kashmir, and set the tone for Indian-Pakistani relations thereafter. The relationship between them remains one of the most difficult and potentially dangerous ones in world diplomacy. The conflict was a bitter pill to swallow for the many Indians who had once dreamed of unification, not least of all, Gandhi. After independence, Gandhi continued to work to heal relations between Hindus and Muslims. He was pursuing this goal when he traveled to Delhi in January 1948 to deliver speeches and conduct prayer meetings to bring the two faiths together. However, one Nataram Godse believed that such behavior was a betrayal of Hindus. On the evening of January 30th, he leapt from the crowd as Gandhi walked to a prayer meeting and fired 3 shots that fatally wounded him. The death of Gandhi was a sudden and brutal blow to the country. Nehru broadcast to the nation telling them, "Friends and comrades, the light has gone out of our lives and there is darkness everywhere. And I don't quite know what to tell you or how to say it." Gandhi's death provoked riots across the country, and his assassin was hanged. However, his death could not totally overshadow the opening of a new chapter in Indian history. It had been a long road, and the destination wasn't quite what many hoped. But Gandhi had lived to see an independent India, ruled by its own people for the first time in centuries. India's new constitution came into force on January 26, 1950, and outlined the vision of the country and how it planned to tackle the problems it faced. Firstly, India would be a democracy with voting rights extended to all citizens above 21, and protections for freedom of speech, association, and political affiliation. The Lok Sabha, People's Assembly, and the Rajya Sabha, States Assembly, formed the two houses of India's legislature, while executive power was wielded by the Prime Minister. Jawaharlal Nehru and his Congress Party won the first elections in a landslide. Secondly, the Indian government was to be secular. Given India's rich religious diversity, staking the government in any one faith would lead to conflict. People of all faiths were entitled to the same protections, privileges, and rights as anyone else. A similar view was taken towards language. While Hindi would be the predominant language, other languages like Bengali, Tamil, and Marathi were similarly protected and endorsed for official use in areas of the country that favored them. India's linguistic differences heavily informed the initial division of India's states. Protections were also given towards two groups historically discriminated against: the so-called scheduled castes, untouchables, and the scheduled tribes, Adivasis. The legal category of untouchable was officially abolished and reservations were set aside in a range of areas from university places to legislative seats to guarantee representation for scheduled tribes and castes. Much like affirmative action in the United States, India believed that positive discrimination in favor of historically mistreated groups could help address the consequences of that mistreatment. Jawaharlal Nehru continued to lead India through its early years of independence and played a vital role in shaping his country. Economically, Nehru was a socialist, though not a full-on communist, and favored state direction of the economy rather than relying on the market. His economic policy was based around 5-year plans that directed government investment in particular industries and involved some nationalization. Nehru was something of a moderate, though, and often disappointed India's more left-wing forces by not nationalizing more industries or clamping down harder on private business. Ultimately, his economic approach seemed to work, and India enjoyed incredible growth and recovery in the post-war years. By 1965, India had the 7th highest industrial output in the world, and per capita GDP greatly increased, although it still remained far below that of Western nations. Socially, Nehru's term saw many reforms that expanded minority and women's rights. His government ended caste restrictions on marriage, raised the minimum marriage age, and expanded women's inheritance rights. Education also improved markedly in the 1950s and 70s, with thousands of new schools and universities. In 1950, 23 Indian institutes of technology were established to provide high-quality education in their fields, and they remain some of the most successful and respected educational institutions in India. In foreign policy, India walked a path of careful neutrality. While Nehru's socialist economic leanings inclined it towards the USSR, India was keen to maintain diplomatic and economic relations with the West, and as a result, became a pillar of the global non-aligned movement. Still, this neutrality didn't prevent India getting into disputes. In 1961, tensions reached their height between India and Portugal. Portugal had kept control of Goa since the 16th century and had refused to cede its control at Indian independence. Attempts to resolve the issue diplomatically failed, and in December 1961, India launched Operation Vijay, Victory, to retake it by force. 50 people were killed in 2 days of fighting before India successfully annexed Goa. The war achieved its aims, but was sharply criticized in the West as an unnecessarily aggressive move that compromised India's carefully practiced neutrality. India also found itself at odds with Communist China on several issues. In 1959, they offered sanctuary to the Dalai Lama following the brutal Chinese response to the Tibetan uprising, which angered Beijing. Meanwhile, the two countries had ongoing border disputes over control of the Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh regions, which boiled over into war in October 1962. The Sino-Indian War lasted a month and claimed 2,000 lives, mostly Indian, and China successfully seized most of the territory it wanted. India agreed to a ceasefire on November 21st in what was clearly a defeat. Nehru suddenly had a heart attack in 1964. After a brief 2-year term for Lal Bahadur Shastri, who also died suddenly of a heart attack, the office of Prime Minister fell to Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi, no relation to Mahatma, symbolized the dominance of the Gandhi-Nehru political dynasty started by her grandfather. She took power in 1966 and proved to be one of India's most significant and divisive leaders. She was a talented and ruthless politician, but was accused of nepotism, corruption, and dictatorial tendencies during their term. In some ways, she was very successful. She presided over a green revolution that modernized Indian agriculture and made India the world's 6th nuclear state in 1974. Arguably her most famous act was her intervention in the Bangladesh War of Independence in 1971. Discrimination against Bengalis in what was then East Pakistan by the Urdu majority of West Pakistan led the modern nation of Bangladesh to assert its independence that year. Pakistan responded harshly with a wave of violence that was widely considered to be a genocide. Indira was a staunch supporter of Bangladesh and fierce critic of Pakistan. She brought global attention to the conflict and pressured the US to cut off military aid to Pakistan. On December 3, 1971, Pakistan launched military strikes on India, claiming they were preemptive attacks against a planned Indian invasion. India responded with a lightning campaign of air and naval strikes which crippled the Pakistani military, and sent its troops into Bangladesh to help the rebels. By December 17th, Pakistan was defeated and forced to submit to a ceasefire, ending both the Third Indo-Pakistani War, the Bangladeshi genocide, and Bangladesh's bloody struggle for independence. On the other hand, Indira's nepotism, which saw her promote her sons Sanjay and Rajiv to high positions in government, was a permanent blot on her record. Worse were the allegations of corruption and her response to them. In 1975, she was found guilty of election manipulation and ordered to leave office, but she defied the court and declared a state of emergency to stay in power. She used her newfound powers to pass sweeping censorship of the media and purged government and party officials to replace them with her loyalists. This state of emergency effectively made Indira Gandhi a dictator, albeit one with popular support, and was kept for almost 2 years. Months of rule by decrease, coupled with economic issues like inflation, eventually undermined her support. When she finally called another election in 1977, Indira and Congress were swept out of office by the Janata Party. The Janata Party struggled to deal with India's problems. Prime Minister Morarji Desai was a capable diplomat and a respected man, but he was not able to navigate the personal and political rivalries of his government, and it collapsed in July 1979. Desai was replaced with Charan Singh, who lasted just 23 days in office before his government collapsed too. When elections were held again in January 1980, Indians turned back to the promised stability of Indira Gandhi. However, the days of her dynasty were numbered. A few months after returning to power, her eldest son Sanjay died in a plane crash, eliminating the planned heir to their political dynasty. But the death knell for Indira Gandhi's reign and life would be rung in the Punjab with Operation Blue Star. While Sikhs mostly accepted their status in India, there was and remains a powerful faction of Sikh separatists, calling for an independent Sikh state in the Punjab. In 1984, Indira's government was informed by the USSR that the US and Pakistan were supporting Sikh separatists, preparing to launch a rebellion. Allegations that are now understood to have been false. Indira moved preemptively, launching Operation Blue Star to crack down on Sikh groups in the region. She sent troops and tanks against the revered Golden Temple in Amritsar, one of the holiest sites in Sikhism, in a week-long street battle with Sikh dissidents. Hundreds died on both sides, and Sikhs across India and the world were outraged. This outrage found a deadly outlet on October 31st, 1984. When 2 of Indira Gandhi's Sikh bodyguards assassinated her in her garden as she headed to a TV interview. Her death shocked India, provoking riots and anti-Sikh violence that killed hundreds. After her death, her son Rajiv was ushered into power. During his 5-year tenure, Rajiv presided over economic renewal and several regional insurgencies, most notably among Sikhs in the Punjab and separatists in Assam. India also responded to an appeal from Sri Lanka to send troops to quell the Tamil Tigers on the island from 1987 to 1990, which India feared might encourage Tamil separatism on the mainland. This, however, proved to be the undoing of the dynasty. Rajiv was voted out of office in 1989, replaced by Vishwanath Singh, but Rajiv hoped to echo his mother by returning to power in a few years. However, on May 21, 1991, Rajiv was assassinated by a suicide bomber on the campaign trail near Chennai. The attacker was a supporter of the Tamil Tigers, who opposed Rajiv's suggestions that India return to finish off the Tigers. Rajiv's death brought an end to the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty that had led India for 40 of its 44 years of independence. But as India marched towards the 21st century, things were clearly improving in virtually every area. Through the 1980s, India imported technology and goods such as televisions and computers that rapidly modernized the country. Agriculture improved with farming technology and fertilizer banishing the famines that had hounded India for centuries. Urbanization accelerated rapidly, and 1 in 4 Indians lived in cities by the turn of the millennium. All these imports caused an imbalance of trade which reached a crisis point in 1991, forcing a readjustment towards a more liberal economic approach. India opened itself up to more foreign investment, rolled back regulations, and scaled back government control of the economy. Per capita GDP rose sharply over the following years, rising almost 50% between 1990 and 2000 and continuing a meteoric rise after 2000. It was also a period of political diversity as Congress lost its traditional dominance over politics in new parties. Especially the Nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, emerged to shape politics. India saw a period of coalition governments that continued until 2014, with several short-lived prime ministers failing to serve out their full terms as alliances shifted and collapsed. A modernizing society and economy did not mean an end to old rivalries. Relations with Pakistan continued to be difficult despite attempts to improve them. In 1999, the two nations fought their fourth war, known as the Kargil War, after Pakistani soldiers crossed the Indian LoC in Kashmir. Stakes were higher than ever, since Pakistan had acquired nuclear weapons back in 1974. But after 12 weeks of fighting and some 1,000 to 4,000 dead across both sides, India came out victorious, and the two powers resumed an uneasy peace. India entered the new millennium stronger and more numerous than ever before. On May 11, 2000, Asta Arora became India's billionth person, and the population has continued to rise. Since then, India has faced down many of the same challenges that have plagued the rest of the world. The challenges of climate hit India hard in 2004 with the Boxing Day tsunami, which killed an estimated 16,000 people in Southeast India, alongside around 20,000 more across Southeast Asia. Floods have continued to pose a challenge, such as in 2013 where some 6,000 lost their lives to flooding across northern India, as have earthquakes like the 2001 Gujarat quake that claimed 20,000 lives. India has been on the front line of the war on terror, facing numerous deadly terrorist attacks through the 2000s. Mumbai suffered especially hard, with 200 people being killed in a train bombing in 2006 and another 175 slain in a mass shooting in 2008. The government has also contended with homegrown insurgencies, namely the Nazalite Maoist communists who have been operating in areas of eastern India, committing violent attacks on civilians, soldiers, and politicians that have claimed hundreds of lives. Economically, India joined most of the world in a steep recession in 2008, but close trade with China, which also weathered the crisis better than much of the world, and less risky lending practices from Indian banks meant India bounced back faster than most countries. What was a year-spanning crisis for most ended up being a brief disruption to an otherwise steady growth for India's economy. India has been especially successful when it comes to technology. Indian universities are among the most productive in the world for graduates in science, technology, and engineering, and Indian graduates in these fields have an international reputation that has led to comparatively higher representation of Indians in the tech industry in places like Silicon Valley. Few developments in Indian technology have been quite as talked about as its space program. In 2013, they successfully put a probe in orbit around Mars, and in 2023 achieved their first successful landing on the Moon. In 2014, India opened a new chapter under Narendra Modi and his BJP. Forming the first non-coalition government in 30 years, Modi has earned enthusiastic supporters and bitter enemies. To his supporters, he is a strong leader capable of decisive action for India's best interests. To his critics, he is an authoritarian whose nationalist blustering is a danger to India's minorities and to world peace. Economically, Modi embraces a globalist economic perspective, with active participation in global trade and investment. Many credit him with India's continued rise, with India overtaking the UK in 2022 to become the world's fifth largest economy. Others lament the rising social and economic inequality of modern India that has accompanied this rise. Socially, Modi has revived the Hindutva national ideology that emphasizes India's Hindu heritage. A celebration of India's treasured past it may be, but one that leaves little place for Muslims, Sikhs, or others who do not share this faith. Diplomatically, he has navigated a fraying global order, keeping strong ties with the US and European countries, and with the BRICS economies, of which it is a founding member. However, the ever-present tension with Pakistan and unresolved issues with China continue to be delicate issues. It's far too early to judge Modi with any objectivity, and his time leading India doesn't look to be ending anytime soon. In March 2024, India overtook China to become the world's most populous nation. Never in human history have so many people rallied under the same flag. With such a huge nation comes huge opportunities. and most analysts expect India to keep growing economically, culturally, and politically, with many predicting that it might be a superpower on par with China or the US by the end of the century. But with that also comes huge problems. The logistics of feeding, housing, caring, and representing its massive population is a task that will make or break India. And navigating the deep divisions at home and abroad will take all of India's effort. Looking back on India's history though, many of its strengths and weaknesses are ones it's dealt with for millennia. On January 22, 2024, Prime Minister Modi presided over the inauguration of a temple to Ram, or Rama, in Ayodhya. According to the Ramayana, the divine hero was born on that exact spot, and its opening was a celebration for Hindus and a major occasion for subscribers to Modi's Hindutva ideology. The event captured many of the themes we've seen throughout Indian history. On its face, it symbolized the power of Hinduism and of the Sanskrit texts that continue to be revered in India as strongly as they've ever been. Modi's participation in the ceremony can be seen as a modern iteration of the ancient tradition of leaders supporting temples during their reign. But there was also the shadow of violence and division over the ceremony. The Babri Masjid Mosque had once stood on the site, built by the Mughals in 1528, and burned by Hindu radicals, some linked to the BJP, in 1992. The specter of religious violence and foreign conquest of India therefore lingered in the background of the day's events, and was much discussed by Modi's opponents across news and social media. One can look at India's history to find parallels. Is the opening of the temple another entry in a long and proud list of Indian achievements? A symbol of both faith and political power, an expression of a new golden age like those attributed to the Mauryans, the Guptas, or the Mughals? Or will Modi's favoring of one faith, one group, one people in India's rich tapestry take modern India down the path that it has so often walked before, of division and eventual collapse like that of the Bahmani, the Mughals, or the British? Failing to manage the diversity of India has shed plenty of blood and toppled many empires that have stood for far longer than the relatively young nation that has yet to see its 80th birthday. And there is always the concern that, as the world order shifts once more, the new global hegemons might try to plunder India's wealth for their own gain, as so many empires before them have tried. But for all the similarities with the past, it is easy to forget what has changed. India has never been more unified, more numerous, more advanced, more wealthy, or more powerful than it is today. To quote Modi speaking at the opening of the Ram Temple, "The wait of centuries has come to an end. Now, what lies ahead?" It's anyone's guess, but whatever challenges await it, India has never been in a stronger position to meet them.